Story 1.
The suburb of Shermay in Romania had long been left behind. The dirt road obediently stretched under the wheels of the worn-out gray Audi. But the driver knew that within half an hour, it would turn into a soggy country lane. The wipers tirelessly swept the water off the windshield, and the rain kept pouring as it should in mid-October. There is a feeling I get when I look to the west and my spirit is crying for leaving. Played softly in the car. My spirit is yearning to leave too, the driver mumbled, flicking his lighter. The farther, the better. Since the cabin light was off, the flame briefly illuminated a rather handsome face with a straight nose and high cheekbones. After lighting the cigarette, he pocketed the lighter and focused back on the road, especially since the dirt road had ended. The soggy ground had begun. Why? Just why did I come here? George Farkas, an inspector from the Shermay Police Department, wondered to himself. He couldn't even remember the exact name of the village situated between Shermay and the city of Salonta, where he had been sent for an investigation. A god-forsaken hole with no police station. But there was a corpse, and there had to be a criminal. Why couldn't he have stayed in his hometown of Kaposvar in Hungary? Why didn't he go to study in Budapest? Why did he, still a schoolboy, end up in the homeland of Vlad Dracula, nicknamed the Impaler? Cultural exchange, or a way to escape a home where career success was expected of him? From then on, everything went according to plan. Excellent results on almost all exams, dual citizenship, the academy, and lo and behold, a job close to the Hungarian border, where both languages, native and learned, were in demand. Who here needed his vast linguistic abilities? So be it. George smirked and stubbed out the cigarette in the ashtray. After Stairway to Heaven, Misty Mountain Hop followed. The half-bare trees along the road gave way to disheveled bushes, and then, out of the darkness, the guardrails of a bridge over the Crisel Negru River appeared. So, it was close. In the village on the riverbank, there wasn't a single law enforcement officer, so the police authorities of the two neighboring cities, unable to find common ground as usual, made the most idiotic decision, in Farkas's opinion, sending one officer from each city to the crime scene. Through the veil of rain, blurry spots of light broke through. These were the windows of houses glowing. The village, as it turned out after a glance at the sign, was called Skornesti. It had only 2 streets, one running east to west, the other north to south. There were no house numbers or street lighting. Ah, the good old Romanian backcountry. As if nothing had changed since the times of Vlad III. Even now, George was not heading to the Skornesti administration head, but simply to the village elder. At the intersection of the 2 streets stood 4 main village buildings: a school, a hospital, a grocery store, and the administrative building, which also served as the elder's house. And in this 2-story brick house, the light was on. Fortunately for the Shermay police officer, the night and rain had driven the locals into their homes, so he avoided curious glances. Parking near the porch, George pulled on his jacket sleeves and tried to cover the distance from the car to the front door as quickly as possible. The door opened before he had a chance to find the doorbell. He was expected, and the engine noise could be heard even through the rain. Standing before Farkas was a stout, middle-aged woman, likely the wife of the elder, head of the administration. "Are you from Shermay?" she asked. "Yes," he nodded, pushing back his hood and smoothing his black hair with his hand. "The coat rack is by the wall." Farkas noticed that the woman paid more attention to securing the latch than to her guest. "Come into the office. I'll bring some tea. No need to take off your shoes." Refuting the claim about police officers lacking a conscience, George wiped his boots on the doormat before entering. The furnishings on the first floor were quite institutional, from which Farkas concluded that the living quarters were upstairs. In the office, tea was being drunk, and small talk was being exchanged by a stocky, mustachioed man, in whom only the blind wouldn't recognize the elder, and an investigator from Salanta. More precisely, an investigator, round-faced, short-haired, a young woman in jeans and a sweater. Perched on her upturned nose were glasses with thin frames. The conversation had just reached the point where the older man began to tell the younger one in detail about the times of Ceausescu. "Good evening," George drew their attention, pulling out his badge from his inner pocket. "Inspector George Farkas, from the Shermay Police Department." "Ah, you're the one we've been waiting for." The elder circled the table, scrutinized the visitor's badge, and satisfied, extended his hand. "Michael Petrianu." "Nice to meet you." "Investigator Simona Drakel." The young woman greeted him with a friendly smile as she stood up to meet her colleague. "This little one, is she a fan of the Impaler?" George thought as he shook her small hand. "An investigator? Is she even 25? God, what a mess." He was spared the need to come up with a compliment for the investigator by Mrs. Petrianu. The woman brought in tea and silently withdrew, though her silence was equivalent to saying, "Hope these sit-downs are worth something." Nevertheless, sitting down on a chair that had seen better days and sipping the strong tea, George felt he was approaching a state resembling bliss. Mrs. Petrianu had added cherry liquor to the tea. Anyway, Michael glanced at the clock showing 11:30 and downed the rest of his tea in one mighty gulp. "I've already told Mrs. Drakel everything, so I'll just repeat. Sylvia was found this morning. The last time she was seen by half of Skornesti was 2 weeks ago when she left for her sister's place in Salanta. She often went there for a day or two, sometimes for a week or so no one was surprised until she was fished out of the river. That's it." "Did you see the body?" Farkas asked Simona. "No. I arrived 2 hours ago and decided to wait for you." The investigator adjusted her glasses. "You can see it now if you like. Alex has insomnia anyway." "Who, sorry?" "Alex Biashu, our doctor," Petrianu clarified. "In that case, I see no reason to put it off until tomorrow." George finished his tea and stood up. "Especially since tomorrow is almost here." Simona eagerly sprang to her feet, and Farkas finally understood why they had sent her. A murder is a serious matter, but in a place like Skornesti, it's almost impossible to botch it. In a village where everyone knows everyone, it's hard not to find the killer. The inspector felt a slight pang of envy. Simona Drakel, lucky with her superiors, was sent to gain experience because the muscle, if needed, would be the Shermay colleague. George Farkas, on the other hand, was sent by superiors who didn't like him, simply to deal with something that any rookie could handle. On the way to the hospital, Simona handed George a small jar that smelled strongly of mint. "What's this?" "Something like Vaseline. I swiped it from our pathologist." The girl's glasses gleamed from under her hood. "Rub it under your nose, you know. Bodies." "Got it, thanks." Farkas smiled. A resourceful girl, this Drakel. Corpses that must be examined as part of the job aren't always found immediately. George couldn't stand the stench of decomposition, but at least it never made him sick. As for Simona, judging by her voice, she had a worse relationship with this smell than he did. The door was opened by a lanky, graying man. Judging by the dark circles under his eyes and the smell of valerian, he really did suffer from insomnia. After a brief exchange of greetings and introductions, Alex Biashu led the officers and the elder to the morgue. Not that the village hospital particularly needed this room, but no doctor ever knows when they'll have to deal with a corpse or how long they'll have to wait for a city pathologist. "Here, take a look," the doctor said in a colorless voice, lifting the white sheet. "Oh." Simona quietly exhaled a cloud of steam. The temperature in the morgue was lower than outside. George mentally agreed with his colleague. Indeed. Oh. The body lying on the table belonged to a woman in her 30s, dark-haired and very likely attractive. At least she had been attractive before spending a week in the river. The cause of death was obvious. A deep, jagged wound on her neck. What had caused it, Farkas couldn't immediately determine, as the water and river creatures had worked on the corpse. Nevertheless, the crime clearly fell under the category of murder with particular cruelty. "Tell me, Dr. Bieshu." George accepted the thin file containing the preliminary examination report from Alex, but didn't rush to open it. "Was anything found under the victim's nails?" "Yes," the doctor nodded. "Wolf fur. So, what do we have?" A week ago, Sylvia Bogner was returning home from Salanta, where she had been visiting her sister. She was returning late in the evening, but as usual, she didn't take a taxi because she was an athletic woman and rode a bicycle. It was quite a distance, but enough to keep her in shape. Mrs. Bogner wasn't afraid of anything in her native surroundings, even at night, especially since she had a permit to carry a weapon. The lady's revolver didn't help her. Near the village, someone attacked Sylvia and tore her throat open. The fur under her nails suggested that Sylvia was killed by wolves. But this possibility was cast into doubt by Dr. Bieshu, who determined that the wound on the woman's neck was inflicted by claws, which is not typical for wolves. Two other factors also argued against a wolf attack. First, starving predators usually attack in winter or early spring, and second, wolves wouldn't have dragged the body away from the road to dump it in the river. The only remaining question was, did the killer actually eat the victim's liver? "Inspector Farkas, are you awake?" A whisper came from the door. "No, I'm not asleep," George muttered, groping for his shirt, and was glad he had gone to bed without taking off his jeans. The Petrianu house had a guest room, but only one, so George had graciously spared the lady of his company by sleeping in the living room. "Can't sleep?" He smirked as Simona Drakel slipped into the room with a guilty look. "Can't sleep," the young woman admitted. Mrs. Petrianu said the locals still believe in werewolves. I'm saying this because everyone seems to find Sylvia Bogner's murder strange. Mr. Petrianu didn't tell you anything because he didn't want you to laugh at him. He claims the killer is some lunatic named Mark, whom Bogner turned down. And what do you think? Could it be a maniac? George cracked the window open, now that the rain had stopped, and lit a cigarette. He didn't have time to offer one to the investigator. She had already shaken her head in advance. The inspector tossed the pack of cigarettes onto the couch, turned on the wall lamp to avoid talking in complete darkness, and settled back by the window. A maniac would have done his work demonstratively for show. He wouldn't have thrown the body into the river. On the contrary, he would have left it in plain sight. Most likely, this is revenge. And most likely, it was someone Sylvia knew well and didn't feel the need to reach for her weapon. 9 out of 10, the killer is a local. Besides, the killer wanted the first thought to be about wolves. Claws can be made of iron after all. And I don't believe the killer ate her liver. People, Miss Dracul, are exceptionally inventive creatures. I wish I had your confidence, Simona sighed. I've never dealt with murders before. Farkas flicked the cigarette butt into the darkness outside the window. May I ask a personal question? Where did I get that surname? Drakel smirked. Exactly. I changed it 3 years ago. I've always admired Vlad Dracula. He was a great man, though cruel. He almost won the war against the Ottoman Empire. Well, he wouldn't have defeated such a monster. Farkas recalled his history lessons. The Sultan had an army of 250,000 men. He would have won, Simona insisted stubbornly, if Matthias Corvinus hadn't betrayed him. Her brown eyes gleamed as if it were Farkas himself who had advised King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary in the 15th century to betray Vlad Dracula, the ruler of Wallachia. Well, it was clear what her favorite subject in school had been. All right. George raised his hand in a conciliatory gesture. I admit, our king wasn't a saint. But it's been half a millennium, and tomorrow we have to interview a damn lot of people. Don't you think, Miss Drackle, it would be wise to get some sleep? Early the next morning, Inspector Farkas not only shaved but also put on a tie, although he despised the noose around his neck almost as much as the stench of decay. However, duty called, and when it came to interviewing the local population, many still viewed a tie as a sign of respectability. By evening, George and Simona had gathered statements from almost all the adult residents of Skornesti. Some were charmed by Inspector Farkas, others by Investigator Drackle, and others still by their stern eyebrows and official badges. However, more than half of these statements were of no value whatsoever or were overly detailed. No, it's better for a police officer not to be overly charming. After sifting through the unnecessary details, it turned out that Sylvia Bogner was loved in the village only by the school children and their parents, who couldn't get enough of their children's successes. The rest of the Skornesti residents disapproved of her too liberal lifestyle by village standards. If she weren't a teacher from God, she would have long been kicked out of her job. However, the village primary school only had 3 teachers. 3 people had no alibi for the time of the murder. First on the list of suspects was Mark Bishu, the cousin of the local doctor. Contrary to popular belief, he wasn't insane, but simply a person with an incredibly bad temper and a right to carry a weapon. He didn't live in the village for long periods, had no permanent job, and refused to give a statement in a particularly harsh manner. Michael Petrianu insisted on Mark's guilt, pointing to his hot temper, and the fact that shortly before the murder, Mark and Sylvia had a heated argument. The other 2 without an alibi were the victim's colleagues, 2 school teachers, both single women. One of them, a grandmotherly figure, Ilona Olt, claimed she was bedridden with a fever, while the other, Sylvia's contemporary Lena Ionescu, refused to explain anything. The only thing Simona heard from the irate Ionescu about Bogner's murder was, "Serves her right." "Without a warrant, we can't arrest him, interrogate him, or search his place," Simona Drackle concluded gloomily, staring into her empty coffee cup. "And he won't give a statement no matter what." Farkas paced back and forth across the room they had occupied in Mr. Petrianu's house, pulled out and put away the pack of cigarettes again, and swallowed a curse. Everything that had happened in Skornesti bore the mark of the famous Romanian carelessness. Dr. Bieshu lacked the necessary equipment and qualifications for a thorough medical examination. Instead of fixing the situation, the authorities had sent 2 people here, hoping they would deduce and solve the case. It was, of course, easier and cheaper, but George hated playing the role of the Lord. "I wouldn't rule out Ionescu's guilt if I were you," George said, though he couldn't remember when he and Simona had switched to informal terms today. Although, he suddenly tossed his jacket to the young woman and grabbed his own. "Let's go." "Where to?" Simona barely managed to keep up with his long strides as she hurriedly put on her jacket. "To the crime scene," Farkas replied to his colleague and to Mrs. Petrianu, who had peeked out at the noise. "Only the local amateurs have combed through there." The road that Sylvia Bogner had traveled for the last time in her life ran along the river. The inspector and the investigator arrived at the scene within 15 minutes. It was getting dark, so George pulled a couple of flashlights from the trunk. "What are we looking for?" Simona asked. "Something the local trackers didn't look for, and that hasn't washed away in a week." They stepped off the road where Sylvia's bicycle had been found and moved toward the river. Farkas believed that this was where the body had been dragged to the water. He had a vague idea of what to look for after a week of continuous rain. The first thing that came to mind was a cigarette butt, as only Mark among the 3 suspects smoked. "George, I found something." Farkas hurried to Simona, but when he got there he realized she was no longer focused on her discovery. The young woman was shining her flashlight between the trees, listening intently. "Someone's there," she whispered. As if in response, something cracked and rustled in the darkness. It could have been a wolf, a fox, or another careless forest creature. Or maybe not. George drew his pistol from its holster and took a few steps toward the sound. "Who's there?" he demanded as firmly as he could. No one answered. But about 100 meters away, 2 green eyes lit up. The flashlight beam caught dirty gray fur in the darkness. And then the creature began to approach rapidly. Farkas fired. 3 times. Whoever or whatever this green-eyed beast was, and it definitely wasn't human, it should have taken 3 bullets to the chest or neck. But it didn't stop. It only grew more enraged. Dying a heroic death at the fangs of a maddened beast was not in George Farkas's plans. Grabbing Simona by the sleeve, he bolted out of the forest. Fortunately, Drackle was a fast runner too, and she didn't stumble once. "Get in the car!" Farkas barked as they burst onto the road. He could feel the pursuit on the back of his neck. Whipping around, he aimed both the flashlight and the pistol in one direction and emptied the entire magazine into the shaggy shadow. The lead knocked the creature down, but it clearly didn't kill it. Meanwhile, Simona scrambled into the car and flung open the driver's side door. Before the mysterious beast could recover, George leaped behind the wheel, slammed the door shut, and tossed the gun into Simona's lap. "Magazine in the glove compartment. Reload it," he ordered, starting the engine. He barely had time to pull away from the shoulder when the still alive and lively creature burst onto the road. Seeing it in the headlights, Simona let out a squeak, and George went pale as a sheet. A wolf, standing on its hind legs and towering like a calf, that's what it resembled. However, Farkas hadn't forgotten where the gas pedal was in his fear. The gray Audi, splashing mud, shot forward and knocked the shaggy beast aside. For half a minute, George could still see the creature in the rearview mirror. It was chasing the car, awkwardly swiping at the air with its broken paw. Hand. Damn it. George exhaled, loosening the knot of his tie with one hand. "A werewolf," Simona whimpered. "It's all true. It can't be." Farkas wanted to shout, but he bit his tongue. How else could you explain a shaggy humanoid with a wolf's head? When the mud-splattered gray Audi stopped in front of the hospital, Dr. Alex Bieshu was still awake. Lately, he hadn't been sleeping much at all. Responding to the loud and persistent knocking, the doctor opened the back door, which led closer to the 2 rooms he occupied. "Do you have a problem?" he asked, though the signs of shock were all over his guests' faces. "A whole trainload of them," the disheveled inspector nodded, letting his colleague go ahead and glancing into the darkness before stepping inside. "Can I help with anything?" "First, please give us something for our nerves." Farkas slid the bolt, peered out the window, shrugged off his jacket, and only then turned to the doctor. Bieshu noticed that he did all this without letting go of the pistol in his right hand. "For the nerves," Alex chuckled. "Sit down, Miss Drackle." The young woman was trembling, and it took her a moment to realize he was addressing her. A minute later, 3 glasses and a bottle of plum moonshine were on the table. "It helps with the nerves very well," the doctor explained, pouring. George downed half a glass in one gulp, while Simona didn't dare such a feat, sipping her medicine in small sips, and Alex barely touched his glass. He was waiting for questions. The inspector didn't keep him waiting long. He placed the pistol on the table and stared intently into the doctor's eyes. "Now, doctor, tell us what's really going on here." "We've got a werewolf in the village." "That's unscientific." Farkas chuckled nervously, gripping a cigarette between his lips, trying to light it, and then noticing that his hands were shaking. "Damn it. Looks like you need more than your colleague does." Bieshu poured him another glass of moonshine, which was at least 50 proof. The medicine had indeed already worked on Simona. The trembling had stopped, her cheeks were flushed, but her gaze remained clear. "You're right." George knocked back another half glass, exhaled sharply, and continued. "There must be some explanation. Listen, back during Ceausescu's time, before the fall of the Soviet Union, were there any experiments conducted here?" Inspector Farkas was 12 when the USSR collapsed and even younger when Ceausescu was overthrown, so he could barely, but possibly, believe in mysterious secret research because believing in werewolves... "Impossible," reason screamed. "Open your eyes," common sense replied. "No experiments, no secret facilities." The doctor shook his head sadly. There was another knock at the door, again from the back entrance. Alex went to open it, and George finally lit his cigarette and turned to the now silent Simona. "Do you have a weapon?" The young woman nodded. The doctor returned, and with him came a tall, stocky, bearded man with a rifle slung over his shoulder, looking every bit the seasoned hunter. "Ah, you're still alive, cop." He smirked, leaning the rifle against the wall. "Did you see the beast? So did you crap your pants from fear?" "So you knew, Mr. Bieshu." George gave Mark an icy glare. "I knew," he nodded, sitting down at the table. "I figured you're a quick guy, you'd manage to get out. But I had Miss Drackle with me. You put a woman's life at risk." "My apologies, Miss Drackle." The man's black beard split into a cheeky grin. "But I think if you join the police, you should be aware of the risks." "I am aware." The young woman snapped. "Irresponsibility seems to be a part of the national consciousness in this country," George muttered through clenched teeth. "Listen, cop, shove your Hungarian pride. You know where." Mark slapped his palm on the tabletop. "Maybe we should talk about the case," the doctor calmly suggested, placing a 4th glass on the table and pouring out more medicine. "But why didn't you tell us anything?" Simona asked, wiping her glasses. "We could have—" "Think with your head, miss," Mark laughed. "Who would have believed me? You'd have arrested me in a minute, and I'd be not only a killer with a split personality, but also a psycho obsessed with mysticism. Petrianu is already jumping out of his pants to pin Sylvia's murder on me. And by the way, you can't do anything. You, Magyar, can try to call for backup, and I'll watch as the medics take you away. In other words, Miss Drackle, we're in deep shit, as the Poles say." Farkas stubbed out his cigarette in the ashtray and reached for another. Everyone but Simona joined him. He couldn't help but acknowledge the reasonableness of Mark's arguments. He really would have considered him a paranoid schizophrenic if he had started talking about werewolves. And he and Investigator Drackle really had no choice but to catch the beast themselves. I almost forgot. Drackle rummaged through her pockets and pulled out a silver cross on a broken chain. "I found this in the forest." "Sylvia's cross," Mark muttered. "I'll kill that bastard if I don't die first." May I take a look? Alex put on his glasses and took the chain from the investigator. The silver at the break had blackened. There's something like burnt skin and singed fur between the links. Exactly. The doctor's cousin snapped his fingers and grabbed his glass. Silver is the only thing that can take these bastards down, although they're damn resilient. Did you two shoot at it? I emptied the entire magazine into it, George replied grimly. Didn't do a damn thing. And George seemed to break its paw when he ran it over, Simona added. Lead is nothing, but the bone will take at least half a day to heal. How do you know so much about these creatures? The young woman asked. I encountered them while serving in the army, and later when I specifically traveled to Poland, then in Slovakia, Western Ukraine, Russia. George nearly choked on his drink. Are you saying that this isn't a one-off mutation? Mutation? Mark sneered. They're everywhere, and they've been around for a long time. Ever read any fairy tales? There's probably something like them in New Zealand, too. Did you think humans are the rulers of nature, the pinnacle of the food chain? Welcome to the New World, Magyar. Farkas was silent for a while, digesting the news. After all, if you look at the statistics of missing persons, Mark Bieshu's words seemed plausible. Wait, what about Western Europe? You can't just eat a person there. Right, buddy, his inner voice remarked sardonically. They don't just eat there, they eat civilly. All right, no arguing with facts. The inspector pulled himself together. If it's a werewolf, it should be human by day. How do we track it down? Any distinguishing marks? This is the first case in our area. Alex Bieshu took the floor. It takes a month to turn into a werewolf. So it's someone who was absent from the village a month or a month and a half ago and brought the infection here. We have 3 candidates. Michael Petrianu, Lena Ionescu, and an old pensioner everyone calls Grandpa Stefan. Stefan's out. Mark waved his hand dismissively. He's got a silver wedding ring. And Ionescu has no alibi. Simona exchanged glances with George. Here's what I suggest. Mark decided to wrap things up. Tomorrow morning you two come to me and I'll make you some silver bullets. I know how to cast them and I've got the equipment. Then we'll see if anyone comes to Alex for a broken arm, and Ionescu won't go anywhere during the day. As if to confirm the existence of Murphy's Law, everything went far from smoothly as planned. It all started with something going wrong with the silver, and since no one else knew how to cast bullets, Mark ended up fiddling with it until almost evening. At sunset, George and Simona, equipped with a magazine of silver bullets each and one silver-plated stiletto between them, finally went to get Ionescu. Mark prudently stayed behind to guard the back door. Farkas had contacted Dr. Bieshu beforehand. He hadn't expected his mobile phone to come in handy in such a hole as Skornesti. It turned out that the doctor had been visited twice during the day. Mrs. Petrianu had come for medicine, and Lena Ionescu had come with a serious dislocation, allegedly the result of an unfortunate fall from a ladder. A dislocation isn't a fracture, but still. The tall, swarthy woman frowned at the visitors. We'd like to ask you a few questions. Well, come in. She nodded toward the living room. George discreetly tried to position himself so that Simona was always behind him. They had agreed that if it came to close combat with the creature, he would be the one to engage. He had secured the stiletto along his forearm, and Mircha's words kept flashing through his mind. Claws are nothing. But if the beast bites you and you survive, you'll become a shapeshifter yourself in a month. Would you like some tea? Ionescu offered, not too insistently. No, thank you. We won't take much of your time. Tell me, does this item look familiar? With these words, The inspector pulled a small plastic bag from his pocket and took out the silver chain. This was it, the moment of truth. Farkas was ready for Ionescu to sprout claws at any moment, but... Yes, that's Sylvia's chain and cross. Lena took the mangled piece of jewelry in her hands without even flinching, and then George noticed that her right hand was bandaged, though he distinctly remembered breaking the creature's left arm. "Is that all you wanted to know?" the teacher asked, handing the chain back. Not quite. The inspector tried not to show how thrown off he was. "You don't have an alibi, Miss Ionescu." Simona saved the situation. "Considering your statements about the victim, could you tell us where you were on the night of October 9th? I shouldn't have spoken so badly about the dead," the woman sighed. "I was with Lucian that night. Ask him. He'll confirm it, just don't ask in front of his wife." "Understood. Thank you for your cooperation, Miss Ionescu. All the best." As soon as they stepped off the porch, George called Mark. He felt lousy. The tension and sleepless night were taking their toll. Simona was lucky. She had slept like a log until morning, while he couldn't sleep even after the moonshine. "False alarm, Mark. It's not her." "Damn it all to hell!" Bishu barked on the other end. "Get over here. I don't care who the werewolf is. We're tracking that beast tonight." George looked at the crimson streak of the dying sunset. The sun was gone, and now all the cards were in the werewolf's hands. "Go to him. I'll catch up." When Simona had left, he tried once more to gather his thoughts. The pensioner Stefan had an alibi, and so did Michael Petrianu. Wait. George quickly dialed Alex Bieshu's number. "Doctor, it's Farkas." "What's going on?" the doctor asked, sounding worried. "Lena Ionescu is clean. Tell me, what did Mrs. Petrianu take from you?" "Sleeping pills, antibiotics, and an orthopedic bandage." "Does she suffer from insomnia?" "Yes, she takes sleeping pills regularly." Alex's voice grew increasingly puzzled. "Thank you, doctor, and don't leave the hospital tonight." George had barely finished the conversation when his phone rang piercingly. It was Simona. "George, he killed him." "Stay where you are," Farkas ordered, already running. Mark Bishu's house was literally a stone's throw from the hospital. Had George not known what the man was actually involved in, he would have mistaken his home for the lair of a terrorist moonlighting as a smuggler of precious metals, specifically silver. The inspector arrived within 2 minutes. Dracul, looking green, was sitting on the porch with a mobile phone in one hand and a pistol in the other. Without a word, Farkas looked inside. The heavy stench of blood hit him immediately. "We've lost our Van Helsing." He turned away from the mutilated corpse and the severed head. The hunter hadn't had time to use his rifle against the werewolf. "I called for backup," Simona said. "I didn't mention the werewolf. They'll be here in an hour and a half to 2 hours. "Too long?" George punched the door frame in frustration. "He'll escape by then. Let's go." The investigator hurried after her colleague. With nightfall, both streets had become quiet and empty. It seemed the residents of Skornesti truly believed in the werewolf and were hoping either for luck or for desperate people like the late Mark. "It's Michael," Farkas said as they walked. "He has an alibi." "He doesn't have an alibi. His wife takes sleeping pills, which means she wouldn't wake up even if cannons were fired. This morning, she took an orthopedic bandage from the doctor. Michael must have already healed." The door to Michael Petrianu's house was unlocked. George tossed his jacket by the entrance to avoid being restricted in movement and told Simona to stay behind him. Near the entrance to the office lay Mrs. Petrianu in a pool of blood. Her carotid artery had been torn out. The werewolf had decided to make a break for it and leave no witnesses. That meant he might still be here. Watch the exit and the basement stairs while I check upstairs. Farkas pointed the investigator to a strategic spot between the door and the staircase. If anything happens, don't play the hero. Dive into the pantry. The door seems sturdy. Trying not to show her fear, Drakel nodded. The inspector shifted the pistol to his left hand, drew his stiletto, and climbed to the second floor. He had a feeling the werewolf was still here and wouldn't leave until he finished off those who had been chasing him. After all, during his service, Farkas had solved 2 murders and had the right to trust his instincts. However, the living quarters were empty. "George? Is that you?" A voice called from downstairs, and his blood ran cold. "No. Shoot." He bellowed at the top of his lungs and rushed toward the stairs. A shot rang out below, then another, followed by a howl, a scream, a crash, and silence. Simona. Taking the stairs 3 at a time, Farkas flew into the hall, but it was empty. Only a bloody trail led to the basement. Drakel had managed to wound the beast. "I'm here." Simona's voice came from the pantry. "He heard you and ran off. I'm coming out now." But George didn't let her out. The bookcase standing by the wall, which he shoved with his shoulder, crashed to the floor, blocking the pantry door. "What are you doing?" Drakel screamed. "The backup will get you out." Farkas wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "Take care, Simona." "George, what are you doing? Let me out. You can't handle this alone. That thing is huge." Simona yelled, but he was no longer listening. The inspector remembered the layout of the house. He had inquired about it, not suspecting Michael at the time, but just out of habit. There was a second exit from the basement, to the garage. That's where George headed. "Have you lost your mind, pal?" His inner voice, playing the role of common sense and self-preservation instinct, asked sarcastically, "You can't handle this alone." "Maybe I have, maybe I can't," George mentally snapped back. "But I won't risk Simona's life. She's poorly trained for this, and you've got your eye on her, haven't you, Magyar? What difference does it make now? I screwed up." "Yeah, pal, you screwed up. First time in your life, but big time. Because of you, Petrianu's wife is dead. Mark is dead. If you'd turned on your brain sooner instead of suffering from lack of sleep and a hangover, you would have figured out Michael earlier. Well, are you ready to pay the price?" "I'm ready," George said quietly as he stepped into the garage. "Are you Michael?" Michael Petrianu, or rather the creature he had turned into, was crawling out of the hatch in the floor. Upon seeing the human, it growled and lunged at him. Despite the injured paw, it moved fast, very fast. George managed to fire 4 shots before the beast knocked him off his feet and sent the pistol flying from his hand. Almost all hand-to-hand combat techniques proved useless against a werewolf, and the only thing Farkas could do was keep the fangs from his throat. The werewolf slashed at his opponent with its claws, while George struggled to land a fatal blow. Even gravely injured, the werewolf was inhumanly strong, and the silver only enraged it further, triggering a reverse transformation. Too slow for it to become vulnerable as a human again. More by hearing than feeling, George realized 2 ribs had cracked one after the other, and he knew he wouldn't last much longer on adrenaline. The pain would overwhelm him, and the werewolf would finish him off. Abruptly ceasing his resistance, George allowed the creature to latch onto him with all its claws, freed his right hand, and swiftly drove the stiletto under the werewolf's jaw. Brain death was instantaneous. The beast twitched and went limp. He had no strength left to stand. Clutching the torn wound in his side and leaving a trail of blood, George simply crawled away from the gray carcass and leaned against the garage wall. Poor Simona, he thought. She'll have to explain all this mess. It's up to her because he would bleed out before the backup arrived. None of the locals would dare leave their houses at night. and there was no calling for Dr. Bieshu's help. His phone was in his jacket. George Farkas suddenly realized he didn't care anymore. Outside, the rain started again.
Story 2.
We were driving down the highway on a gloomy, overcast day, the air heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and echoes of a recent rain. The engine of our old Ford purred like an elderly cat, while dreary landscapes flickered past the windows like an endless ribbon of memories. My friends John, Michael, and I had just enrolled in a university in the neighboring state. This was our first major journey, and although we were all a bit nervous, the car was filled with a calm silence, broken only by the rustle of tires on the asphalt and occasional sighs. John was driving, and I sat next to him, staring at the endless road ahead. Michael was sprawled in the back seat, his eyes half closed, but I knew he was listening to every word we said. "We're almost there," John finally said, breaking the silence. I snapped out of my thoughts and looked at my friend. He was tall, with broad shoulders and sharp facial features. His blonde hair was always slightly tousled, as if the wind never left him alone. We were heading to a house that John had inherited from his grandmother. He must have been thinking about her because I noticed him gripping the steering wheel tighter. My grandmother started acting strange in the last years before she died. John unexpectedly began to recount, his eyes fixed on the road, but his voice tinged with uncertainty and sadness. After my grandfather passed away, she lived alone and rarely left the house. Dad wanted to hire a caregiver for her, but she refused, saying it was better for her to be alone, to not endanger others. We didn't understand what she meant. Soon she began saying that someone was watching her. We took her to the hospital, but tests showed that her mind was fine. So why did she see these visions? Over time, she stopped talking about it, and we thought she was getting better. He paused, took a deep breath, and continued. 6 months ago, she was found hanged in the kitchen. Everyone said she had gone mad, but I remember her differently, kind and caring. She was a teacher at the local school and always helped those in need. It's sad how it all ended. I wish I could go back and talk to her about her worries. Michael, who had been sitting in the back, leaned forward, intrigued by the story. He was slightly shorter than John, with dark hair and always a bit of stubble, giving him a scruffy look. I looked at my friend, trying to comprehend what he had gone through. John didn't like to talk about his grandmother, but today seemed to be a special occasion. His voice trembled as he said, "Maybe I'll be able to understand what happened to her when we get there." But then he laughed, breaking the grim silence. "Sorry, guys, for getting all gloomy on you," he said, shaking his head. "After all, we're heading to a new place and going to live on our own. That's pretty cool, isn't it?" His laugh sounded a bit nervous, but it helped lighten the mood. I smiled too, but my thoughts weren't as cheerful. Was it wise for us to stay where John had such bad memories? I was also a bit uneasy about staying in a house where someone had died, but free housing was a significant factor. Soon, we entered a typical mid-sized American town with a population of about 50,000. The streets were paved with old asphalt, and cozy houses with well-kept lawns and white fences lined the sides. We drove past the town center, where there were small shops, diners, and an old movie theater with a neon sign. People strolled leisurely along the sidewalks, enjoying the cool evening. After driving a few more blocks, we found ourselves in a quieter neighborhood, where the houses were farther apart, surrounded by dense gardens and old trees. Finally, John turned onto a narrow gravel road, leading to our new home. It was a 2-story house with a simple yet elegant design. The walls were painted light gray, and the roof was covered with dark shingles. A small garden with flower beds struggling for survival among the weeds spread around the house. The facade featured large windows, framed in white, through which the evening sun's light streamed in. A veranda stretched along the front of the house, supported by slightly weathered but still sturdy wooden columns. On the veranda were two old rocking chairs, seemingly waiting for their owners to share stories of bygone times. We approached the massive front door, and John pulled a key from his pocket. He hesitated for a moment, as if gathering his courage, before inserting the key into the lock. The door creaked open with a long, mournful groan as we stepped inside. The house smelled of dust and old wooden floors that had long been neglected. The first thing we saw was a spacious hallway with a high ceiling. In the center hung an antique chandelier covered in cobwebs. On either side of the hall were doors leading to other rooms. Along the walls were portraits, which I guessed were John's relatives. We began to explore the house, driven by curiosity and a hint of excitement. Turning left, we found ourselves in a cozy living room with a fireplace and shelves filled with old books. Dusty curtains were half drawn, letting in weak evening light, giving the room a mysterious atmosphere. In the corner stood an old piano, its lid covered with a layer of dust. Moving further, we turned right and discovered a spacious, bright kitchen in dire need of renovation. The stove and refrigerator looked old but functional. Along one wall was a large wooden table surrounded by several chairs. Climbing the creaky stairs to the second floor, we found 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. Each bedroom was modestly but comfortably furnished. We began unloading our belongings from the car and carrying them into the house. I took my bag to my room and started unpacking. Pulling the cover off the bed, I found the mattress still in good condition. I carefully arranged my books on the shelf and hung my clothes in the closet. Michael set up his computer on the desk, connecting cables and laying out his books and notebooks. John, meanwhile, started unpacking his things and dusting off the furniture. When we finished unpacking and settling into our rooms, fatigue began to take its toll. John suggested, "Hey guys, how about we have a beer and relax? We deserve it." Michael and I gladly agreed. We went down to the kitchen and opened the fridge, where John found a couple of bottles of beer. We sat at the large wooden table, which now looked much better after we cleaned it and put our things on the shelves. "To new beginnings," John said, raising his bottle. Michael and I clinked our bottles with his and took a sip of beer, enjoying the moment of silence and tranquility. The light of the evening sun streamed through the windows, painting the room in warm tones. The next day, we got up early, full of energy and determination to get the house in order. We divided up the tasks. Michael took the kitchen and living room, John the bedrooms and bathroom, and I took the hall and staircase. When we finished the main cleaning, John said, "Guys, I found the entrance to the attic, but I couldn't find the key. We should look through the cabinets, maybe it's lying around somewhere." We agreed it was an important task, but decided to leave it for later. We had a couple of days left before classes started, and we continued setting up the house. We bought the necessary groceries, dishes, and cleaning supplies to make our stay more comfortable. We also checked the internet connection and set up our computers. Finally, classes began, and our lives gradually fell into a routine. We were enrolled in different faculties. John studied engineering, Michael went for humanities, and I chose computer technology. There were no problems at home, and we quickly adapted to the new routine. However, I noticed something strange. There were no mirrors or even the slightest reflective objects in the house. The spoons and dishes were either plastic or non-glossy. This seemed odd and a bit unsettling, but I didn't give it much thought. A week went by, and one night when I came home from school, it was already late. Exhaustion hit me, and I decided to take a shower and go straight to bed. That night was unusually stuffy. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing on my chest. I lay in bed, tossing and turning, trying to find a comfortable position, but it was hard to breathe. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the attic. At first, I thought I imagined it, but the sound repeated, clear and insistent. These were light but distinct steps, as if someone was slowly walking in the attic. My heart started to beat faster, and I couldn't sleep. Gathering my courage, I got out of bed and went to check what was happening. Climbing the creaky stairs, I saw a lock hanging on the attic door. This seemed strange to me. If the lock was in place, who or what could have been making those sounds? I stood there for a few minutes, listening to the silence. The footsteps had stopped, and the house was quiet again. I thought perhaps I had just imagined it, and returned to my room. However, the feeling of unease didn't leave me. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself that it was just my imagination, brought on by exhaustion and the stuffy air. Returning to bed, I couldn't sleep for a long time, listening to every rustle. Finally, worn out by anxiety and trying to explain the strange sounds, I fell into a restless sleep. But deep down, I had a sense that something was wrong in the house, something we had yet to uncover. The next day, I didn't tell the guys about the previous night, afraid of seeming strange. I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural, and my nature was always to seek rational explanations. So I decided to find out what had happened the night before. Perhaps a raccoon had gotten into the attic or something similar. Going outside, I walked around the house, inspecting it from all sides and trying to see the roof, but I saw nothing unusual. Then I asked the guys if they had found the attic keys. They shook their heads, and I decided to drop the subject. Another week passed without anything unusual happening, but one day when I came back from school, I found John in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table, staring into space, looking like his soul was somewhere far away. His face was pale, his eyes wide open and full of horror. He didn't react to my arrival, as if he were in a trance. "John, what's wrong?" I asked, approaching him. He didn't answer. I looked at the table and saw a spoon I had recently bought lying next to him. In its dull reflection, I didn't notice anything strange, but something about the scene sent a chill down my spine. John suddenly shuddered as if waking from a nightmare. His eyes slowly focused on me, but they still held a trace of mad terror. Did you see it?" he croaked, his voice hoarse and broken. "See what?" I asked, feeling my anxiety grow. "In the reflection," John whispered, his voice trembling. "There was something creepy. It was staring at me from that damn spoon." His hands were shaking, and I noticed beads of sweat forming on his forehead. John looked like he had spent the night in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. His hair was disheveled, and his shirt was wrinkled, as if he hadn't slept all night and had spent it tossing and turning. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing with thoughts of what it could be, but no rational explanation came to mind. "Maybe you need to rest," I suggested, trying to speak in a soothing tone. John nodded, but his eyes were still full of fear. He slowly got up, and I helped him to his room. When he lay down, I returned to the kitchen to take another look at the spoon. In its dull reflection, I again saw nothing strange, but the feeling of unease didn't leave me. When Michael came back, I told him what had happened with John, and we went to check on him. John was sleeping in his bedroom, but his sleep was restless. He was covered in sweat, tossing and turning, repeating, "No, no, no." Then he screamed and started breathing rapidly. We rushed to him, asking what was wrong, but he looked at us with terrified eyes and didn't respond. We helped him up and guided him to the kitchen, where we poured him some water. John looked at the glass warily, but trembling, he took it and drank it all in one gulp. "Come on, buddy, tell us what happened," I said, looking him in the eyes. John sighed and, dropping his shoulders wearily, said, "If I tell you, you probably won't believe me." "Just tell us," I insisted. John sat up straighter as if preparing for an important speech and began to speak. "I came back from school and decided to do some cleaning," John started, his voice quiet but tense. "While cleaning the closet, I found an old box of keys. Among them was one that looked unusual. I immediately thought of the attic and decided to check if this key would fit." John paused, as if gathering his thoughts, then continued. "I went up to the attic and tried the key in the lock. It fit. When I opened the door, it was dark and dusty inside. I took a flashlight and started inspecting the space. In the corner, I saw an old chest. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years." John fell silent again, his gaze growing more troubled. I approached the chest and opened it. Inside were old books, photographs, and a mirror, a small oval mirror with a carved frame. I picked it up, and when I looked at the reflection, I saw not only my face. There was something else, a dark figure with glowing eyes. He froze, his eyes widening in horror, as if reliving the moment. That figure, it was staring right at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I dropped the mirror and ran out of the attic, locking the door behind me. "But the worst part is that now I see that creature in every reflection," John finished, looking at us with fearful eyes, expecting us not to believe him. And indeed I didn't. I thought he had started to lose his mind, and to my shame, I remembered his grandmother. Could it be hereditary? Michael tried to calm our friend, saying everything was okay, and asked if John wanted to go to the hospital, but John shook his head. "I knew you wouldn't believe me." Then Michael said, "Okay, you said the mirror is in the attic. We'll go and take a look." John grabbed his hand. "Are you crazy? I wouldn't wish this on anyone, especially you guys. Don't go up there." But Michael pulled away and said, "Don't worry. I don't think there's anything there." I nodded in agreement, and we decided to go up to the attic. We climbed the creaky stairs, each step sounding like a sinister warning. John followed behind, pleading with us not to do this, but his words went unheeded. The stairs led to an old door that John had forgotten to close. The attic was dark and dusty, filled with the smell of old things and abandonment. We turned on our flashlights and began to explore the room. In the corner stood the old chest. We approached it, and Michael opened the lid. Inside were old books, photographs, and a mirror. A small oval mirror with a carved frame. It lay among other items, looking innocent but ominous. I picked up the mirror, and Michael and I looked into it. At first nothing happened besides our reflections, but then bloody numbers began to appear on the surface. First 663. Then it quickly disappeared and 664 appeared. We nearly dropped the mirror in surprise. Suddenly we heard heavy breathing and a wheezing sound echoing through the attic. We turned around but saw nothing. The sound seemed unreal, as if it was coming from the mirror itself. We looked back at the mirror, and what we saw made our hearts stop. A terrifying figure appeared in the reflection, a werewolf. Its eyes glowed red, and long claws and sharp teeth were visible even in the dim light. It was staring directly at us, and its breathing grew louder and louder. The mirror trembled in my hands, and I could barely hold on to it. "Quick, get out!" John screamed, his voice filled with panic. We threw the mirror back into the chest and bolted for the exit. My heart pounded like crazy. I was gripped by panic, a cold chill running down my spine and my legs trembling. We dashed into the kitchen without stopping, as if the embodiment of horror itself was chasing us. In the kitchen, we stopped, breathing heavily. We looked at each other, trying to grasp what had just happened. "Is this a dream?" Michael exhaled, his face deathly pale. "What's going on?" I felt my body shaking from fear and adrenaline. I tried to calm down and grabbed a glass of water, gulping it down, hoping it would help. But when I set the glass down on the table, my gaze fell on the blade of a knife lying nearby. In the reflection of the blade, I saw an eye. It was staring right at me, unblinking, full of malicious and cunning watchfulness. I froze, feeling cold sweat running down my back. At that moment, I heard someone's breath in my ear, heavy and sinister. I screamed and jumped back, feeling fear paralyze my body. "No, no, no," I mumbled, unable to look away from the knife. "Did you see that? In the reflection?" Michael and John looked at me with concern and fear, trying to understand what was happening. John, even paler than before, stepped towards me. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice trembling. "An eye. There was an eye," I breathed, pointing at the knife. It was watching me, and I heard breathing. We stood there in horror, not knowing what to do next. John sank to his knees, clutching his head in his hands, repeating, "I told you not to go up there. Don't go up there." Michael took a step back, his face white. "What do we do now?" he asked, looking at me with desperation. I didn't know what to say. My mind was blank, and the only thing I felt was the cold fear gripping my entire body. Your grandmother must have seen this creature too," I realized, looking at John. We looked at each other in fright, understanding that she had ultimately found no way out and ended her life. We sat in silence for a long time, trying to gather ourselves. Then Michael said, "Let's sleep. Maybe everything will be better tomorrow." We nodded and went to our rooms, but I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning in bed, listening to every rustle. Only in the morning did sleep finally take me. I woke up around noon, realizing I had already missed my morning classes. Sleepy and irritable, I went to wash up in the bathroom. Thank God, there was still no mirror there. We hadn't had a chance to buy one yet. Then I went to the kitchen and saw Michael standing by the table. He was looking at the knife's blade, as if deciding whether to look into the reflection. "Michael, what are you doing?" I asked as I entered the kitchen. He flinched and turned to me. "I want to check if it's gone." We exchanged anxious glances and slowly approached the table. Fearfully, we both looked into the reflection of the knife. But there was only our reflection. No shadow, no eye, no terrible creature. "Nothing," Michael whispered, his voice full of relief. "Yes, nothing," I confirmed, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. We called John, and he came running, his face still pale and tense. "Look, John," Michael said, pointing at the knife. John looked into the reflection and saw nothing either. The three of us stood there, realizing that the horror of the past night might have just been a nightmare. Relief filled the kitchen, and we started to laugh from the nervous tension. "Maybe it really was just a nightmare," John said, smiling weakly. We hugged each other, feeling more confident. It seemed that it had all been a dream, and now, seeing nothing scary, life was returning to normal. We quickly gathered for school, discussing our plans for the day and trying not to think about the previous night. Although a deep-seated anxiety remained, we decided not to dwell on it. Arriving at the university and seeing so many people, my tension began to ease. We walked towards the campus, trying to immerse ourselves in the usual student life. but for some reason, I instinctively avoided looking at the mirrors we passed. I was afraid of seeing that creature again. After a few classes, we decided to grab a bite and headed to the university cafeteria. Entering, we took our food and sat down at a table. The spoons were crystal clear and polished, reflecting the light and surroundings. When I picked up the spoon and was about to eat, suddenly, in the reflection, I saw an eye. It was staring right at me, full of malice and hatred. I was so scared that I dropped the spoon on the floor. My friends turned to me, their faces full of concern. Michael, noticing my reaction, cautiously looked at his spoon. He didn't drop it, but slowly lowered it, his face turning pale. "You see it too?" he whispered, his voice trembling. John jumped up and ran to the counter, returning with plastic spoons. "Here," he said, handing them to us. But our appetites were gone, and we decided to head back home. As we walked through the lobby, we noticed a large mirror hanging on the wall. It drew our attention, and we couldn't help but look at it. In the reflection, we saw our figures, but behind us, hunched and moving slowly, was that same creature. Its eyes glowed red, its long claws and distorted face visible even in the dim light of the lobby. It moved like a shadow following us. In the reflection, we could see its heavy breathing and hear its wheezing. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests, fear gripping us. I felt cold sweat trickle down my back. "What do we do?" Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't look," John said, his voice trembling, but he tried to stay calm. "Just don't look in mirrors." We turned away from the mirror and quickly headed for the exit, feeling the creature in the reflection still following us. We returned home, trying not to look at our reflections in the glass doors and windows. Gathering in the kitchen, we tried to figure out how to solve this problem. Fear and anxiety hung in the air. "We need to go and smash the mirror," Michael suggested, his voice resolute. I hesitated. "If that was possible, your grandmother would have done it already. But we can try." We decided to test his suggestion. Grabbing a hammer from the closet, we headed up to the attic. The stairs creaked under our feet, and the air grew heavier. Opening the attic door, we entered, and I saw the old chest with the mirror again. "Ready?" John asked, his hands trembling as he held the hammer. I nodded, and Michael stepped back, giving John space to swing. John raised the hammer and struck the mirror with all his might. The sound of the blow echoed through the attic, but the mirror remained intact. Not even a scratch, as if it was protected by an invisible barrier. John struck again and again, but each blow was useless. With each hit, the creature in the mirror seemed to grow angrier. Its eyes glowed brighter, and its face twisted with rage. It seemed the blows only fueled its fury. We went downstairs, feeling helpless. "So, that doesn't work," Michael said, his voice full of disappointment. "What do we do now?" "Maybe just don't look in mirrors?" John suggested. But even he realized it was a foolish idea. On one hand, if you think about it, this creature has only been watching us and hasn't harmed us directly. But every time I see it, an instinctive fear awakens in me. And it's not a pleasant feeling. And the feeling of constantly being watched isn't great either. We fell silent, realizing our situation had become even more complicated. We needed to find another way to deal with this creature, understand its nature, and perhaps find a way to banish it forever. But for now, we didn't know what to do, and fear followed us everywhere like a shadow. We sat together and decided that tomorrow we would start looking for ways to solve our problem. It was something mystical, and we needed to seek answers from such specialists. That evening we went to bed. I was sleepy and exhausted since I hadn't slept well the night before. When I lay down on the bed, I immediately fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up from the stuffiness. The air in the room was heavy and thick, as if someone had closed all the windows and doors. I heard footsteps in the attic. These steps were quiet but distinct, as if someone was cautiously moving across the old, creaky boards. I got up and went into the hallway, where I met the guys. It seemed they had also woken up from the strange sounds. We exchanged worried glances and decided to go check the attic. The stairs creaked under our feet, each step resonating in our hearts like a warning. We opened the attic door and entered, illuminating the way with flashlights. Shadows danced on the walls, creating the illusion of movement. But despite our fears, there was no one there. The attic was empty, only old things, and the chest with the mirror. As we were about to leave, I caught something strange out of the corner of my eye. In the corner of the attic stood a man. It was a firefighter in an old, charred uniform. He was slowly walking around the attic, setting everything on fire. The flames quickly spread, and I felt the heat as if I was in a real fire. "Hey!" I shouted, but the firefighter didn't respond. He continued his work, and the fire spread faster, filling the space around us. Suddenly, I felt someone touch my shoulder. I turned and saw John. His touch seemed to bring me back to reality, and the vision disappeared. The attic was dark and quiet again, with no traces of fire. "What did you see?" Michael asked, his voice shaking with fear. I took a deep breath and told the guys about the firefighter and the fire. They were scared, realizing the house continued to show us its horrors. We decided not to go back to sleep and wait for morning, continuing to look for answers. Sitting at our computers, we sifted through hundreds of pages on the internet, but found nothing similar to our situation. None of us could offer a rational explanation for what was happening. Then we decided to seek answers from spiritualists, mediums, and the church. It made no sense to go to scientists, as everything that was happening defied all logical arguments. When dawn came, we quickly gathered and left the house. Our first stop was the nearest church. Upon entering, we immediately felt a change in atmosphere. The calm and silence characteristic of a sacred place offered some comfort. We found the priest and told him about our experiences. The priest listened attentively, but his face expressed doubt. "I can pray for your home and you, but I fear it may not help." He sprinkled us with holy water and gave each of us a small cross. As we were heading out, I accidentally glanced at the large mirror on the church hall wall. In the reflection, among the parishioners, I saw it. The same creature. It stood behind us, its eyes burning with malice. I froze in place, my heart beating faster. John and Michael saw it too, and the three of us bolted from the church, feeling fear grip us. Then we went to a medium whose address we found online. The medium's house was old and covered by thick trees. Inside, we were greeted by a middle-aged woman with a serious and focused expression. She invited us into her séance room, where a round table covered with a black cloth stood, and candles burned. The medium listened to our story, then closed her eyes and began to move her hands slowly over the table. "I feel a dark presence," she said, "but I cannot banish it from here. You need to seek help from stronger specialists." We thanked her and left, feeling even more dejected. All day we searched for other mediums and spiritualists, but most of them seemed like charlatans. Some offered expensive cleansing rituals, others gave advice that sounded absurd and ridiculous. We returned home, exhausted and disappointed, not knowing what to do next. This time we decided to sleep in the living room, trying to ignore the sounds that might disturb us. We placed all 3 mattresses on the floor and tried to make ourselves as comfortable as possible. Despite our fear and anxiety, we slowly drifted off to sleep. In the morning, someone rang the doorbell. We woke up, still groggy, and went to answer it. A woman in her 40s, dressed in ordinary travel clothes, stood at the door. She wore large glasses and had a slightly anxious expression on her face. "Hello? Does Mrs. Grayson live here?" she asked, looking around at us. We exchanged surprised glances and said, "Mrs. Grayson died 6 months ago. Did you know her?" The woman was visibly shocked. "She died? My God. I didn't know. I've been abroad all this time." We invited her in and she showed us a letter. "I found this letter only yesterday and came here right away," she said, handing us the envelope. We read the letter, and inside it talked about the mirror and the creature. There were details that no one but us could know. The letter warned of the evil contained in the mirror and the need to find a way to banish it. "What do you know about this?" John asked, looking at the woman. "My name is Emily," the woman began, adjusting her large glasses. "I've been studying paranormal phenomena for a long time. In my youth, I came across a story about a mirror that brought death to others. This story started in ancient Rome and stretched through the centuries, leaving a trail of destruction and tragedy. Eventually, this trail led me here, to the USA." We listened to her, holding our breath, as Emily continued. "The mirror we're talking about has a very ancient and grim history. It was first mentioned in the Chronicles of Ancient Rome, where it was believed to belong to a priest who used it for necromancy rituals. They say the mirror was created using dark magic, and the souls of fallen warriors who were trapped in its glass. After the fall of Rome, the mirror disappeared for several centuries, but it resurfaced in the Middle Ages. In the 13th century in England, it ended up in the hands of an alchemist who tried to use it to achieve immortality. Instead, the mirror brought him madness and death. The alchemist perished in a fire that destroyed his laboratory, but the mirror remained unscathed. Over the following centuries, the mirror passed from hand to hand, each new owner suffering from terrible visions and horrific misfortunes. In 18th century France, it belonged to an aristocrat who went insane and killed his entire family before taking his own life. In the 19th century, the mirror ended up in Russia, where it caused mass hysteria in an aristocratic family. At the beginning of the 20th century, the mirror disappeared for several decades, but in the 1950s it reappeared, this time in the USA. Over the last few decades, the mirror has moved around constantly, leaving a trail of destruction and tragedy. Eventually, it ended up with your grandmother, Mrs. Grayson. Emily looked at us with a serious expression. "I don't know exactly what the nature of this mirror is," she said, "but I would like to see it myself. Maybe then I can understand more." We tried to dissuade her. "It's too dangerous," John began, but she insisted. "If I don't see the mirror myself, I can't help you," she said firmly. We exchanged worried glances, but eventually agreed. We took her to the attic. The stairs creaked under our feet, and the air grew heavier as we ascended. When we got there, I opened the chest and pulled out the mirror. Emily watched it closely, trying not to show her fear. When she looked at it, the number 665 appeared on its surface first. Emily frowned, her face growing pale. In the next second, the creature appeared in the mirror, a monster with glowing eyes and a distorted face, its claws visible even in the dim attic light. Emily screamed and stumbled back, dropping the mirror. We caught her to keep her from falling. "This is horrifying," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Now I understand what we're dealing with." We went back downstairs and Emily looked distressed. She sat in a chair holding her head. "This is worse than I thought," she said. "The number 665 puzzled me. I'm afraid that if we see the number 666, it could mean something much more sinister. What does 666 mean? Michael asked, his voice filled with anxiety. 666 is the number of the beast mentioned in the Bible, in the book of Revelation, Emily explained. It's associated with the Antichrist and demonic forces. If this number appears in the mirror, it could mean that the evil contained within it has reached its full power. This could lead to catastrophic consequences not only for you, but for everyone around. We listened to this with shocked faces. Suddenly, Emily pulled out a mirror from her bag, and when she looked at its surface, her face instantly turned pale. The monster appeared in the mirror, the same terrifying image with glowing eyes and a distorted face. She barely held onto the mirror, her hands shaking with fear. Emily quickly put the mirror back in her bag, her breathing unsteady. "What do we do?" John asked, his voice tense with stress. Emily just shook her head, panic and worry in her eyes. "I'll try to figure out how to deal with this," she said, standing up. "For now, stay here and under no circumstances show the mirror to anyone else. It could be very dangerous." We watched as she left the house, her steps quick and determined. We felt helpless, left in a house full of secrets and horrors, not knowing what to do next. Emily promised to return with answers, and we could only hope that she would find a way to deal with this evil. Time passed slowly, and the fear of the unknown gripped us again, leaving a sense that the worst was yet to come. Emily was gone for a couple of days. We held on, though at night we heard various frightening sounds, footsteps, rustling, quiet knocks. These sounds heightened our tension and fear, but we tried not to panic. On the third evening, she returned. We saw her from the window and hurried to open the door. Emily looked exhausted, her eyes shadowed, and her face pale. She entered the house, barely able to stand. "Water, I need some water," she said, and we hurried to get her a glass. She drank it greedily, and setting the empty glass aside, took a deep breath. "It's hard not to look at reflections," she began. "Mirrors are everywhere, and that creature was constantly watching me. But I found out about a ritual. I don't know if it will help us, but we must try." We listened intently, realizing this might be our only chance. "We need to prepare. Take the mirror. We're going to the garden," Emily said. We quickly grabbed the cursed object, careful not to look at it. Then we went out to the garden, where there was enough space for the ritual. "This ritual is from Christian culture," Emily began to explain. "We need to create a protective circle, sanctify it, and recite exorcism prayers. We'll use holy water, candles, and crosses to banish the evil contained in the mirror." She started pulling these items from her bag, and we began setting the candles in a circle. Emily placed the mirror in the center, surrounding it with crosses. We lit the candles, and their faint light began to illuminate the dark garden. Emily took the holy water and sprinkled the circle, reciting prayers in Latin. We joined her, holding the crosses and repeating the words of the prayer. "O Lord, protect us from the evil contained in this mirror," Emily intoned. "Banish the darkness that threatens our souls and grant us light and peace." We continued praying, and it seemed that the darkness around us began to thicken. Suddenly, sounds emanated from the mirror, wheezing, heavy breathing, and malevolent whispers. The mirror started to tremble as if resisting our ritual. "Don't stop!" Emily shouted. Suddenly a voice interrupted us. "Hey, what are you doing here?" We turned and saw a police officer approaching us from the darkness. He looked curiously at our strange ceremony. "We're performing a cleansing ritual," Emily began to explain, her voice trembling but firm. The officer frowned and came closer, examining the candles, crosses, and the mirror lying in the center of the circle. "What's with the mirror?" he asked, leaning in for a closer look. At that moment, I noticed the surface of the mirror starting to turn red. The officer continued to look, his face turning pale when the number 666 appeared on the mirror. His eyes widened in horror. Suddenly, the air was filled with a deafening roar, coming not from the mirror but from somewhere nearby. We turned and saw a dark figure rising from the pool water, which was not far away. The water didn't ripple, as if the creature was emerging not from it but from its reflection. The figure became more distinct, and we saw something horrifying. It was a creature with long, clawed limbs covered in black fur. Its eyes glowed red like embers, and its teeth were sharp as daggers. "Run!" Emily screamed, her voice shaking with fear. The officer, trembling with terror, pulled out his gun and began shooting at the creature, calling for backup on his radio. The bullet struck the creature, but it didn't react, continuing to advance toward us with the same malevolent determination. "It's useless!" I shouted, grabbing the officer's arm and pulling him back. "We need to run!" We dashed away, stumbling and barely staying on our feet. The creature continued to close in, its roar thundering in our ears, making our hearts pound with fear. The officer ran with us, continuously calling for backup. We didn't look back, feeling the creature's breath on our necks. We ran toward the road, hoping to find help or shelter. The creature pursued us, its massive clawed paws pounding the ground with a menacing rhythm. Its eyes burned with hatred, and it seemed to be targeting us as if we were marked. "Faster!" Michael shouted, glancing back and seeing the creature closing in. I noticed it could move through mirrors and reflective surfaces. As we passed a broken window, its silhouette flickered in the shards, and moments later it reappeared behind us, closing the distance. The creature seemed to glide through any reflections, approaching faster and faster. The officer running beside us was in shock. "What the hell is this thing?" he shouted, but none of us could answer. Our hearts raced, our breath was ragged. We burst onto the road and saw headlights in the distance. "There!" I shouted, pointing to the approaching car. But the creature was too close. Its roar grew louder, and suddenly it vanished, only to reappear in the reflection of the side mirror of the passing car. The vehicle swerved, the driver lost control, and the car crashed into a tree with a loud crack. We kept running, barely keeping our footing. The creature didn't relent, its roar growing louder and more menacing. We ran, not looking back, but I knew it was getting closer. I turned to Emily and shouted, "This thing won't leave us. Any ideas?" Emily held her head, trying to concentrate. Then her eyes widened and she shouted, "We need to try smashing the mirror while the creature isn't around." We decided to split up. John, Emily, and I ran back toward the house, hoping the creature wouldn't follow us. We sprinted down the street, our hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline. It seemed the creature had stayed behind, chasing the others. But as we approached the house, terror gripped me. The creature was perched on the roof, its eyes glowing red, and it seemed to know our plan. It looked down at us, its claws exposed, ready to attack. My heart froze at the sight. "Quick! To the garden!" Emily shouted, and we ran toward the garden where the mirror lay at the ritual site. We almost reached the mirror when the creature suddenly leaped from the roof. It flew at us with incredible speed, its claws aimed directly at us. I thought it was the end when, suddenly, ghostly figures appeared out of nowhere. These spirits held the monster back, their glowing forms surrounding it, holding it in place. John gasped, "Grandma, I see her among them." I saw her too. John's grandmother's figure was among the spirits. They held the creature, giving us precious seconds. "Quick!" Emily shouted, and I grabbed the mirror, placing it on the ground. John raised the hammer, his hands shaking with tension. Gathering all his strength, John struck the mirror with all his might. It cracked, and in the next moment shattered into thousands of pieces. At that instant, the creature let out a deafening roar, its body beginning to dissolve into the air. The spirits vanished too, their mission seemingly complete. We stood, gasping for breath, among the shards of the mirror. Silence enveloped the garden, and we realized the nightmare was finally over. Emily sank to her knees, her face expressing relief. Soon, the police arrived at our house, and we explained everything that had happened, though no one believed us, except for the officer who had witnessed it. The house finally became quiet and peaceful. We cleaned up the remnants of the ritual in the garden and tried to return our lives to normal. However, the memories of what had happened remained with us. I noticed that each of us started avoiding mirrors. Even simple reflections in windows or utensils made us tense. I was afraid to look in the mirror, fearing to see something sinister. We all became a bit paranoid, checking every corner of the house for reflective surfaces and carefully avoiding them.
Story 3.
Happy birthday! The light emanating from the cozy, twinkling lamps enveloped the living room in a warm glow, reflecting off the light yellow tablecloth that seemed even warmer under this illumination. The entire room was filled with signs of domestic comfort. Family photos neatly placed on shelves created a sense of many generations' presence. A corner of the room was adorned with a modest yet lush houseplant, highlighting the homeowner's care for their dwelling. Mom and Dad sat at the table, crowned with a festive cake that stood out against the setting with its bright colors. Around them was set tableware with exquisite patterns, adding a sense of ceremony to the environment. The living room walls were decorated with light, barely noticeable wallpaper patterns that harmoniously matched the overall color scheme of the space. Michael, without uttering a word, entered the room with a tray proudly displaying dishes he had prepared. He sat at the dining table, preferring silence to conversation with his parents, which caused a mix of helplessness and puzzlement in his father. "This child," he said, shaking his head, his gaze fixed on his son, eyes reflecting care and slight disappointment. Dressed in a new suit, the father looked particularly expressive. His appearance spoke of a commitment to order and discipline. The mother, on the other hand, was dressed more casually in a white shirt and jeans, highlighting her relaxed nature and hard work. She found the strength to smile and compliment Michael on the dinner before going to the bathroom. The sound of running water filled the home, creating an illusion of familiar domestic idyll. However, when the mother turned off the water and left the bathroom, a few drops of dark red remained in the sink. "Today is your birthday," the father softly said, addressing Michael. "No matter how busy we are at work, we will always find time to be with you." Michael seemed detached from everything around him. His head was bowed, and his gaze fixed on the TV screen, which continuously broadcasted the evening news. On the screen, a man with a neat hairstyle and impeccably clean face reported on troubling events shaking the city with tension in his voice. "The murderer is at large again. A third body has been found in the old part of our city," the blonde anchor said with particular alarm. "The police have identified a suspect. All citizens are urged to remain calm, lock doors and windows, and avoid late-night walks." While a torrential rain pounded on the window panes and howling winds pierced the streets outside, the house remained a haven of warmth and comfort, only disturbed by these ominous messages from outside. The warm light from the lamps lit the room, creating a contrast with the gloomy atmosphere outside. "Why do you always watch these news?" asked the father with a note of concern in his voice, reaching for the remote to turn off the TV. The media likes to play on people's emotions, spreading fear and anxiety to improve their ratings. Michael silently shifted his gaze from the screen to the comfortably furnished room. All surfaces here were treated with soundproofing materials and coated with sound-absorbing paint, making the space almost completely isolated from the outside world. This feature of the house allowed its inner world to remain inviolate, even if a storm raged outside or other noisy events occurred. Even neighbors living nearby couldn't hear what was happening inside this house, thanks to the high-quality sound insulation. This house could truly be called a fortress. This feature was not just a comfort element, but also a symbol of how Michael tried to shield himself from external problems, keeping his home sanctuary inviolate. Metaphorically speaking, of course. But the news of crimes, penetrating through the TV screen, reminded that it was impossible to completely isolate oneself from the world. Michael lowered his head again, his silence filled with unspoken questions and concerns he was unwilling or unable to share with his parents. In the quiet of the living room stood a modern refrigerator, its air-cooling technology a marvel of efficiency. Equipped with a fan that circulated chilled air within, it promised that the meat stored inside would remain fresh, devoid of any odor that might betray its presence. This refrigerator, a silent guardian of freshness, held within it pieces of meat, each no larger than a fist, wrapped carefully in numerous storage bags designed for preserving the integrity of fresh produce. Adjacent to this, the kitchen workspace was organized meticulously. Packs designed for meat storage lay scattered across the counter, their contents obscured from view, suggesting a routine of preparation and preservation. Below the table, a peculiar machine rested, its purpose unsettling. With the addition of water, it accelerated the decomposition of meat, a stark contrast to the refrigerator's promise of preservation. Beyond the threshold of the bathroom door, a plastic, impermeable curtain stood ready to transform the space into a sealed chamber. In this place, Michael was engaged in meat processing. The mere thought of what lay ahead filled him with a profound sense of dread, his heart heavy with the anticipation of the unpleasant scenes that would soon unfold. Despite the room's cozy decor, an air of discomfort lingered, the weight of the upcoming task causing his hands to tremble slightly. Each element of this scene, from the advanced refrigerator to the simple yet efficient storage solutions, and the ominous machine under the table, spoke of a meticulous and unsettling preparation. The plastic curtain, a barrier to contain what was meant to be hidden, stood as a testament to the lengths Michael was willing to go to maintain this facade of normalcy. "Have some cake. Your father and I braved the relentless rain to get it," his mother said, her voice carrying a mix of fatigue and warmth. After meticulously washing her hands, she carefully unwrapped the cake, its frosting glistening under the kitchen light. With a precision born of tradition, she inserted 18 candles into its surface. There are always 18 of them, Michael thought, but he turned 22 this year. It was their way of clinging to a past filled with brighter birthdays, an attempt to recapture the joy and innocence of those earlier celebrations. "Will you make a wish?" His father's question broke the silence, a hopeful tone in his voice as he lit the first candle. In response, his mother gently turned off the light, plunging the room into a darkness punctuated only by the flickering candlelight. "I hope my parents can stay with me forever." Michael's voice, barely above a whisper, marked the first words he had spoken since his parents' return. It was a confession of his deep-seated fear of loss, wrapped in the simplicity of a birthday wish. Despite the tensions and the distance that sometimes emerged between them, the bond of love remained unbroken, a tether holding them close in the face of life's uncertainties. As the lights flickered back to life, Michael's back was slick with a cold sweat, a physical manifestation of the emotional turmoil that his wish had stirred within him. Methodically, he removed the candles from the cake, wiping them clean with a care that belied his inner turmoil before placing them in an iron box, a repository of years past, each candle a marker of time and memory. If you say your wish out loud, it won't come true. Next time, keep it in your heart, Mother advised with a gentle yet firm tone. Father, however, merely smiled, a silent acknowledgement of the moment. His attention seemed more drawn to the meal before him, eating with an appetite that contrasted sharply with the tense atmosphere. Mother's glance at Michael was sharp, her irritation barely masked as she offered him vegetables with a fork, a silent urging for him to eat. Michael, however, remained disconnected from the meal. A slice of cake sat untouched before him, its presence more a formality than an invitation to indulge. His fingers trembled slightly, a silent testimony to the anxiety that gripped him as he counted his heartbeats, trying to find solace in their steady rhythm against the backdrop of his roiling emotions. The TV continued its relentless intrusion, breaking the strained silence with its ominous updates. "I'm reporting breaking news. It is very likely that the murderer has escaped to one of the residential areas." The anchor's voice was a grim reminder of the world beyond their home, a reminder to the residents of Old Town once again. Be sure to lock your doors and windows and never open the door to strangers. The directive, meant for public safety, seemed to echo through their living room, adding a layer of urgency to the already tense atmosphere. According to the evidence provided by the police, the killer is between 20 and 30 years old. Here is his approximate self-portrait. The screen displayed an image that was all too generic, a chilling reminder of the anonymity with which danger could present itself. Approximately 15 minutes later, Michael observed a subtle but unmistakable change in his parents' demeanor. Their earlier attempts at maintaining normalcy had given way to an unspoken tension, their movements mechanical, as if forced. Trying to distract himself, Michael picked up a piece of cream with a small spoon, the rich, milky flavor a stark contrast to the taste of fear that had settled in his mouth. The sweetness of the cream melting effortlessly provided a momentary distraction from the reality that loomed in his home, a fleeting sense of normalcy in a night that wasn't like this at all. Puff. Suddenly, Michael's mom collapsed to the floor as she wanted to get up to serve the soup. Her hands twitched involuntarily, a silent, disturbing dance of muscles and nerves while her eyelids fluttered before conceding to stillness. The father, witnessing his wife's fall, instinctively lunged to support her but was betrayed by his own body. A leaden weight seemed to anchor his limbs, rendering his legs nearly immobile. A sharp realization pierced Michael's thoughts. Damn. I think I added a large dosage of tranquilizers even though this isn't the first time I've done this. I'm still nervous. Michael's hand stopped shaking and he looked at his parents, their expressions a tableau of confusion and dawning horror. I still can't figure out why this is happening. Am I crazy, or has the world lost its sanity? Michael pondered, his mind a whirlpool of doubt and disquiet. He moved towards the closet with deliberate steps, retrieving heavy chains and large iron handcuffs that clanked with an ominous finality. He began the methodical process of binding his parents, the metal cold and unyielding against their skin. The background noise of the TV continued its relentless broadcast, the news anchor's voice a distant echo reporting on the killer at large. Outside, the rain poured down as if in mourning, its ceaseless patter against the windows a somber soundtrack to the unfolding scene. Yet, for Michael, the storm outside and the dire warnings from the television faded into irrelevance. His focus was singular, consumed by the act he found himself compelled to perform. As he secured the last of the chains, a heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the sound of his breathing and the distant thunder. Why do I keep doing this? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. Michael stood back, surveying his work, a sense of detachment creeping over him. The scene in front of him was staged by himself, and all for the sake of safety. But is it possible to hide from this? The tranquility that had momentarily steadied his hand now gave way to a torrent of confusion and remorse. Had his actions been a desperate bid for control in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic, or the manifestation of a deeper, more insidious turmoil within him? Heaving with effort, Michael labored to move his unconscious parents. Each step towards the basement door, a testament to the weight not just of their bodies but of the act he was committing. The door itself, a heavy iron slab, was a product of his own making. He had spent countless hours, days even, forging and fitting it into place, ensuring its strength. Proudly, it stood as a bulwark, impenetrable to any who might attempt to breach it, a fortress against intrusion, capable of withstanding even the assault of large-caliber weaponry. In Michael's mind, it was not just a door but a declaration of his resolve, an unyielding barrier between his world and that outside. Glancing down at his parents, Michael felt a twinge of something unidentifiable. They lay there, so vulnerable, a stark contrast to the daily visits they paid him, filled with life and concern. Yet in this moment, shrouded in the grim reality of his actions, a haunting but lingered in the air, an ominous shadow over the ritual he found himself ensnared in. With a force born of necessity, Michael thrust the doors open. The chains attached to his parents clinked and clattered, a macabre symphony accompanying their descent into the basement. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, as he began the arduous task of dragging them down the steps, their bodies an unwieldy burden that tested both his strength and his resolve. The basement was a cold but not desolate place. The bare and damp walls seemed to absorb the light, plunging the room into eternal darkness. In the center, like silent sentinels, stood two iron pillars. It was here that Michael had secured his parents, binding them with chains that were as much a part of the ritual as the darkness that enveloped them. As he fastened the chains around the poles, ensuring the bindings were tight, Michael's mind raced. The physical exertion of carrying his parents, the weight of their bodies a mere fraction of the burden he carried within. Every detail of the room spoke of the meticulous planning and execution of his daily ritual. The iron pillars, cold and unyielding, reflected the firmness of the door, serving as a stark reminder of the isolation and finality of this space. It was a place removed from the outside world, a realm where the world obeyed other more savage rules. Yet even as he completed his task, a sense of unease pervaded. The act, repeated though it was, never grew easier, each night a fresh descent into a madness that seemed to have no end. That time has come, his parents have started to change. The transformation was a horrifying spectacle that Michael had witnessed countless times, yet each instant struck him with the same gut-wrenching terror. Under the pale glow of the basement's single bulb, his parents' bodies convulsed violently, their human forms contorting in a gruesome dance of metamorphosis. Thick, coarse wool sprouted across their skin, enveloping them in a matter of seconds, while the sounds of cracking and dislocating bones filled the air with a sickening chorus. their clothes, ill-equipped to accommodate the sudden expansion of muscle and fur, ripped apart, leaving tatters hanging from their newly formed lupine bodies. Chained and transformed, they no longer resembled the people who had raised him with love and care. Instead, two monstrous werewolves stood before Michael, their eyes burning with a feral, unrecognizable hatred. The creatures snarled and snapped, their growls reverberating off the stone walls as they lunged against their bonds, each movement a testament to their overwhelming desire to break free and wreak havoc. Michael's expression, carved from countless nights of sorrow and resignation, bore the weight of his reality. A reality where the parents he cherished would, with the setting of the sun, become the very beasts of legend, creatures of the night doomed to lose their humanity time and again. No matter how fervently he wished for their return, the curse of lycanthropy was unyielding, a cruel twist of fate that science and ancient magic alike refused to acknowledge or remedy. His journey for a cure had been long and fraught with desperation. He had delved into the depths of arcane lore, sought out scientists on the fringes of credibility, and even dared to bargain with forces beyond his understanding. All for naught. The truth was as stark as the transformation he witnessed with each waning light. There was no cure for lycanthropy. The world denied the existence of werewolves, relegating his torment to the realm of myth, leaving him to shoulder the burden in isolation. This was Michael's existence, a cycle of hope and despair, where the lines between love and duty blurred. Each night, as he watched over his transformed parents, he grappled with the duality of his situation. The loneliness was palpable, a constant companion that mirrored the physical chains he used to restrain his parents. It was a loneliness born of knowing that his struggle was his alone, a silent battle fought in the shadows of society's disbelief and the cruel indifference of a world that refused to see the truth hidden in its midst. As the transformation unfolded, the once human features of Michael's parents grotesquely distorted into something otherworldly. Their jaws unhinged, stretching wider than any human mouth should, lined with teeth that seemed to elongate and sharpen before his eyes. The whites of their eyes were marred by the web of blood vessels that burst forth, painting a portrait of agony and ferocity. They writhed on the ground, their bodies contorting in an unsettling dance of desperation, akin to fish gasping for breath on dry land. Despite their monstrous transformation, a moment of eerie lucidity pierced through their frenzy. In unison, their voices, clear and unmistakably human, cut through the chaos. "Stay here, son. Stay with us." The plea, filled with a haunting mix of love and despair, hung heavily in the air. Michael, unfazed, struck a match against the rough surface of the matchbox, the flame briefly illuminating his stoic face before he lit his cigarette. He exhaled a cloud of smoke, watching it mingle with the dim light filtering into the basement. Leaning against the cold, unyielding surface of the staircase, he observed the tragic spectacle with a detachment honed through years of repetition. This ritual, born of necessity and despair, had become the rhythm of his existence. Each morning, as the world outside awoke to the promise of a new day, Michael would don the mask of normalcy and drive to his job, blending into the sea of faces that knew nothing of the nightmare he lived. In the evening, he would return, the key to the basement heavy in his pocket, to release his parents from their daytime prison. And as the night deepened, he would once again lock them away, a guardian of a secret too horrific for the world to comprehend. The cycle was unending, a Sisyphean task that defined his days and haunted his nights. With each lock and unlock, the boundary between his two worlds blurred, leaving him to wonder where his duty ended and his identity began. Was he Michael, the son, the employee, the man with hopes and dreams like any other? Or had he become merely the keeper of the monsters that lurked beneath his home? The gloom of his reality was a constant companion, its weight pressing down on him with every step he took, every breath he drew. Yet, amidst the darkness, moments of poignant clarity emerged, reflections on love, duty, and the human condition. In the eyes of his transformed parents, in their pleas for him to stay, lay the remnants of their humanity, a reminder of the love that once filled their home, now a fortress of solitude and sorrow. As the night wore on, Michael's vigil continued, the smoke from his cigarette a thin veil between him and the beasts that bore his parents' names. The basement, a chamber of secrets and sorrow, held the echoes of a life that could have been, a life interrupted by a curse as old as time itself. In the quiet that followed their transformation, Michael pondered the cruel twist of fate that had led them here, to a life suspended between the mundane and the macabre. He wondered about the nature of the curse that bound them, about the line between man and monster, and about the possibility of redemption in a world that refused to see them as anything but creatures of the night. Michael's memories of a normal life faded, blurred against the backdrop of his current reality. He often caught himself wondering, when did it all change? The days before seemed like a distant dream, one from which he had abruptly awoken. He could barely recall a time when his life wasn't overshadowed by the curse that had befallen his family. It felt like years had slipped by, each one drawing him further from the person he used to be. He remembered the festival night with crystal clarity, the pivotal moment that marked the end of his ordinary world. The city's founding festival had been a grand affair, celebrated with enthusiasm by the community. His parents had left home that evening, spirits high with anticipation, leaving Michael behind. He was young then, too naive to sense the impending doom. The night stretched into days, and days turned into months, yet his parents did not return. Michael's faith in the police's search efforts dwindled as time passed, a growing void filled with despair and unanswered questions. The mystery of his parents' disappearance remained unsolved until that fateful night in late winter. Returning home from a night shift, his life took a turn into the realm of nightmares. The sight that greeted him was something out of a horror tale, a pair of monstrous beings, their forms grotesque and terrifying, engaged in a savage attack on an unsuspecting man. Michael watched in horror, frozen for a moment, as the creatures tore their victim apart with chilling efficiency. The realization that he could be next jolted him into action, fear lending speed to his legs as he fled the scene. Reaching the safety of his home, Michael's first instinct was to secure himself inside, away from the horrors that lurked in the night. He bolted the door, heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, a bitter reminder of his close encounter with death. The safety of his home became his sanctuary, a fortress against the darkness that had revealed itself to him. The day unfolded with the routine rhythm of normalcy, the hours ticking away with no indication that anything out of the ordinary was about to occur. But as dusk began to paint the sky in shades of deep orange and fading purple, an unexpected sound shattered the silence of anticipation, a knock at the door. Michael's heart leaped. With cautious steps he approached, the weight of hope and fear mingling in his chest. As the door creaked open, the sight that greeted him was one he had longed for, yet scarcely dared to hope would come true. His parents stood there, a vision from a past life, their hands holding a cake, a symbol of normalcy and celebration. Joy overwhelmed him, a tidal wave of relief and happiness washing over the shards of his broken reality. In that moment, he was blind to anything beyond their presence. Their appearance, marked by the grime of unknown ordeals and the dark stains of congealed blood on their clothes, registered in Michael's mind, but failed to penetrate the fog of his elation. They embraced, a family reunited, and Michael pushed aside the niggling doubts and questions that tried to surface. The evening passed in a blur of laughter and shared stories, a bittersweet attempt to recapture the warmth of their life before. But as night draped its veil over the world, a chilling transformation unfolded. Retiring to his room, the comfort of Michael's bedroom was soon violated by a horrific intrusion. His parents, the loving figures of his daytime reunion, morphed into monstrous forms before his eyes. The walls of his bedroom became silent witnesses to a nightmare made flesh. Their transformation into werewolves, creatures of primal fury and hunger, was a spectacle of terror and disbelief. It was chaos, a maelstrom of fear and survival instincts, as his father, driven by the beast within, launched himself at Michael with a ferocity that brooked no recognition of their bond. But it was his mother, even in her monstrous state, who became Michael's unlikely savior. A flicker of maternal recognition seemed to pierce through her cursed existence, turning her aggression towards his father and giving Michael a sliver of a chance to escape. The night outside offered no solace, only the cold embrace of a city that slept unaware of the horrors that walked among them. The police, when approached, offered nothing but disbelief and empty assurances. Lost and alone, Michael wandered the gloomy streets until dawn's light offered a semblance of safety to return home to the absence they left behind. The werewolf parents left, but in the evening they returned in human form, holding a cake. They wished Michael a happy birthday again, as if nothing had happened. His parents didn't remember the horror of the night before, and so it began, a cycle of fear and love, of day and night. Michael's life became divided between the joy of their return and the terror of their transformation. It was a precarious existence, balanced on the edge of a knife that threatened to cut too deep. This ordeal became his reality, a secret life filled with unspeakable truths and the constant fear of the night. Each day became a question of survival, each night a test of endurance. In this twisted existence, Michael found himself caught in a perpetual struggle, seeking answers, seeking a cure, seeking an end to the curse that had befallen the ones he loved most. Michael's gaze was fixed upon the two werewolves, his parents, as they voraciously consumed the meat he had prepared. A familiar shiver coursed through him, the kind that had haunted his spine for years now. It was a reaction born not just of fear, but of a deep-seated dread that came with witnessing his loved ones in such a state. Despite the countless times he had seen them transform, the sight never failed to unsettle him, to remind him of the surreal nightmare his life had become. As he stood there, a silent observer to their feast, Michael's mind wandered through the labyrinth of the past few years. Michael's hands trembled, a physical manifestation of his internal turmoil. This involuntary response, a testament to the fear and revulsion that bubbled beneath the surface, was something he had come to accept. It was a reminder of his humanity, of the emotions he grappled with each day as he cared for his parents in their cursed form. Did Michael have a choice? The question was rhetorical, one he had asked himself 1,000 times over. The answer was always the same, a resolute no. His fate had been sealed the moment his parents returned that fateful night, forever altered. Michael had accepted his role as their keeper, their protector, not out of obligation, but out of love. a love that endured even in the face of the unimaginable. The responsibility of caring for them, of ensuring their needs were met while protecting the outside world from their primal instincts, had become his life's work. He had adapted his home, turning it into a sanctuary that could accommodate their dual natures, all the while searching for a cure, for a way to reverse the curse that had stolen their humanity. The preparation of the meat, a task he performed with meticulous care, was but one aspect of his daily ritual. It was a grim necessity, one that pained him deeply, yet it was preferable to the alternative. Michael had learned early on that hunger made them unpredictable, dangerous even to him. Thus, he took every precaution to ensure they were fed, to keep their baser instincts at bay. In the tumultuous early months of his new reality, Michael found himself grappling with an increasingly desperate situation. The initial days were marked by trial and error as he sought to sustain his parents, who had become something unrecognizable. He started with what was most accessible and seemingly humane: beef and pork from the local butcher. However, this attempt at normalcy was met with resistance. His parents, even in their transformed bestial states, initially refused the meat. It was only the gnawing pangs of hunger that eventually compelled them to consume it, their gazes filled with a mixture of resentment and primal need as they devoured the offerings before them. As days turned into weeks, Michael observed with growing dread the physical decline of his parents. The regular meat, far from sustaining them, seemed to hasten their deterioration. They grew weaker, their once powerful forms becoming gaunt, their fur matted and dull. It pained Michael to witness this slow decay, the vibrant beings he knew being consumed by the curse that bound them. Even more disconcerting was the persistent nature of their transformation. Unlike the tales of old, where werewolves reverted to their human forms with the dawn, his parents remained trapped within their monstrous visages, regardless of the time of day. It was during this period of despair that a grim realization dawned on Michael. The diet he provided was fundamentally inadequate. His parents needed human flesh. The thought was abhorrent, a line he never imagined crossing. Yet, faced with the stark choice between their survival and his morals, he found himself driven to act. Securing employment at the morgue offered a macabre solution, a way to procure the necessary sustenance without arousing suspicion. The effect of this new diet was immediate and miraculous. After their first meal of human flesh, his parents showed signs of recovery, regaining some semblance of their former selves by evening. However, this transformation was not without its complications. They returned to him, speaking and acting as if they had come back from a day's work, completely oblivious to the monstrous reality of their existence. Each night, as they succumbed once again to the curse, Michael faced the heartbreaking task of chaining them, ensuring their confinement until the cycle could begin anew. The meat they now consumed with such fervor was a testament to Michael's descent into a world of shadows and secrecy. It was not, as before, sourced from the morgue. The necessity of feeding them had pushed Michael into a darker realm of action, one that saw him stepping beyond the bounds of law and morality. Navigating this new existence, Michael was forced to confront the dual nature of his love for his parents. Each evening, as they greeted him with tired smiles, he played along with the illusion of normalcy, all the while knowing the horrifying truth that awaited with the fall of night. The burden of this knowledge, the weight of his actions, and the constant fear of discovery coalesced into a heavy cloak of isolation that he bore alone. Feeding them became a ritual shrouded in guilt and necessity. Michael meticulously prepared the meat, each portion a reminder of the line he had crossed for their sake. He watched them eat, their humanity momentarily restored, yet marred by the gruesome reality of their sustenance. Michael ascended from the basement, the echo of the heavy iron lock clicking into place behind him resonating through the silent house. The night had stretched long, and weariness tugged at his limbs. He was on the cusp of surrendering to the night's embrace, ready to cleanse the day's grim duties from his skin and seek solace in sleep, when an unexpected sound halted him. A knock, deliberate and insistent, shattered the stillness. A late visitor was unusual enough, but Michael's intuition whispered the identity of his caller, sending a pulse of adrenaline through his veins. His heart accelerated, a mix of anticipation and apprehension tightening his chest as he peered out the window, muscles tensed and ready. The figure that awaited him was unmistakable, a tall man, his silhouette etched against the dimly lit porch, clad in a long black coat that seemed to swallow the light around him. The man's demeanor was grave, his presence alone demanding attention as he knocked again, more firmly this time. Michael's gaze sharpened, a flicker of recognition mixed with surprise lighting his eyes. He's here, earlier than anticipated. This will indeed be interesting, he murmured to himself, a plan rapidly forming in his mind. With quick, deliberate movements, Michael retrieved a rag, the fabric coarse under his fingers. He soaked it in blood, a remnant of the night's earlier necessities, and wrapped it around his leg. The guise of injury was a calculated risk, a ploy designed to add an element of vulnerability to his appearance. Limping, he made his way to the door, each step measured and heavy with feigned difficulty. As he unlatched and pulled the door open, a rush of cool, moist air greeted him, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the house. Michael inhaled deeply, the scent of rain on the verge of falling mingling with the earthy aroma of the night. It was a brief moment of respite, a fleeting connection to the world beyond his doorstep before he faced the man who had come calling. Just as the man in the raincoat, known to Michael as Brad, was about to turn away, the creak of the door signaled his opportunity. The rain, relentless in its downpour, cascaded from the eaves, soaking everything in its path. Brad, fighting to contain a surge of excitement, spun around, his hand clasping the door. "It's pouring out here, Michael. I'm drenched, and you took your sweet time. Didn't expect such a cold welcome from a co-worker, a friend even," he said, a hint of jest in his tone. Michael, masking his discomfort, gestured Brad inside. His limping gait did not go unnoticed as he led the way, the rag around his leg a point of curiosity. Brad's gaze flickered between Michael's makeshift bandage and the pie sitting conspicuously unfinished on the kitchen table, a smile creeping across his face at the domestic scene. "What's with the leg, Michael?" "An accident? Nothing serious. I'll have it looked at tomorrow. But tell me, Brad, what brings you here at this hour?" Michael responded, deflecting with practiced ease. Brad's smile widened, a noticeable change in his demeanor as his breath grew heavier with anticipation. "I wanted to talk to you," he said, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Brad's visit was no mere coincidence. His presence in Michael's home, against the backdrop of a stormy night, was laden with implications. Michael sensed an undercurrent of urgency in Brad's tone, a purpose behind the pleasantries that suggested his visit was more than social. The air between them thickened with unspoken questions, the rain's steady rhythm outside mirroring the rising tension within. The remnants of the evening's rain clung to Brad's shoes, leaving a trail of wet prints on the wooden floor as he stepped inside. Michael quietly observed, then securely locked the door behind them. This moment, this encounter, had been meticulously orchestrated by Michael. He had been laying the groundwork for days. He had deliberately shared his address with Brad, casually mentioning that he would be alone at home and hinting at his struggles with insomnia. It was a calculated move designed to pique Brad's curiosity and ensure his visit. Michael had crafted the scenario with precision, knowing it would draw Brad to him, unsuspecting of the true nature of his invitation. As Brad moved further into the house, Michael's gaze followed him, intense and unyielding. There was a heaviness in Michael's heart, a reluctance that shadowed his actions. He did not relish the hunt, the grim necessity of luring unsuspecting souls to their doom. Yet the survival of his parents, trapped in their monstrous forms, left him with no choice. "Are you hungry?" Michael asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil that churned within him. He gestured towards the spread of food he had prepared earlier, an array of dishes that belied the macabre purpose of their gathering. He poured another glass of water, adding, "It's my birthday today. I happen to have prepared a lot of food. Would you like to try a piece of cake?" "That won't be necessary," Brad replied, his voice polite but firm. Michael noted the refusal, the deliberate distance Brad maintained from the table laden with food. "He doesn't want to touch anything on the table, probably afraid of leaving marks," Michael mused silently. It was a cautious move, perhaps instinctual, that spoke volumes of Brad's wariness, even if his demeanor remained friendly and open. Michael's plan, however, remained unfazed by Brad's caution. The evening was still young, and the true nature of his invitation had yet to unfold. As they engaged in conversation, Michael steered their topics with care, weaving a tapestry of normalcy and camaraderie. Yet beneath the surface, a darker narrative pulsed with life, ready to breach the confines of the ordinary. The house, with its seemingly benign atmosphere, was a stage upon which Michael played his dual roles: the gracious host and the desperate son. Each word, each gesture, was part of a larger, more desperate strategy to sustain the cursed existence he and his parents were condemned to. As the clock ticked away the minutes, the tension between the present facade and the impending revelation grew. Michael was acutely aware of the passage of time, of the precious moments slipping away as he maneuvered towards the inevitable climax of the evening. The quiet of the house was suddenly pierced by a distant noise, a clamor that seemed to emanate from the depths of the basement. Brad's muscles tightened, a surge of alertness sharpening his senses. "You're not alone. I think someone is calling for you," he remarked, an edge of curiosity in his voice, veiling the tension that had crept into his posture. Michael's response came with a twisted smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ah, that would be my parents. They're home as well," he said, his tone casual, yet laced with an undercurrent of something more sinister. "They've been having health issues. They're in the basement. I've had to lock them in for their own safety." The noise from below grew more persistent, a cacophony of sounds that hinted at distress. "They're making quite a racket. Don't you think you should check on them?" Brad pressed, his gaze locked on Michael, searching for any sign of faltering. Michael's smile wavered for a moment before he regained his composure. "They're very ill and need their rest. But if you're so inclined, you could take a look at them," he offered, a challenge underlying his words. Brad's interest was piqued, not by concern for Michael's parents, but by the darker impulses that had guided him to this doorstep. The thought of seeing Michael's parents in distress, witnessing their vulnerability while he executed his long-held desire to harm Michael, thrilled him. This anticipation had been building since the moment he crossed the threshold, a culmination of his darker desires that traced back to the nights they had spent together at the morgue. Back then, the urge to wrap his hands around Michael's neck had been a persistent whisper, now amplified into a roar by the opportunity that lay before him. This moment had been long in the making, a twisted fantasy that Brad had nurtured over countless shifts, watching Michael with a predator's patience. The revelation that the police were on his trail only heightened the stakes. Brad had seen his own sketch broadcasted on the news, a stark reminder that his time was running out. This encounter, then, could be his final act, his last kill before the law caught up to him. The basement, with its hidden occupants and the promise of Michael's vulnerability, offered a stage for this dark culmination. Brad envisioned the scene with a macabre sense of satisfaction, Michael's parents as unwitting participants in their final confrontation. It was a chance Brad was unwilling to let slip, a last dance with fate in the shadow of his impending doom. As Michael watched Brad, a cold calculation behind his affable facade, he weighed his next move. The basement door stood between them and a reckoning, a barrier to the dark truths that simmered beneath the surface of their conversation. Brad's intentions, cloaked in the guise of concern, were not lost on Michael, who understood all too well the danger that lurked in his colleague's eyes. The choices made in the next few minutes would seal their fates, entwining their destinies in a final, deadly embrace. As the storm outside raged on, oblivious to the human drama unfolding within, Michael and Brad stood on the precipice, each poised to play their part in the tragedy that awaited. Michael led the way, the heavy iron door groaning as he pulled it open, revealing the staircase that descended into the gloom. "They're down there," he said, a hint of ominous foreboding in his voice. Brad, driven by a blend of anticipation and a sinister intent, followed, his eyes adjusting to the dimming light as they moved from the warmth of the living room to the palpable chill of the basement air. As they descended, the basement revealed itself in fragments. Patches of light fought against the encroaching darkness, creating a chiaroscuro that lent an eerie atmosphere to the space. Where light and shadow met, monstrous forms began to materialize, each more horrifying than the last. Chained and contorted, the werewolves caught sight of Michael and his unsuspecting guest, their reactions immediate and frenzied. The chains rattled violently as they thrashed against their bonds, their howls filling the air with a primal rage. Brad's initial curiosity morphed into shock as the reality before him unraveled. The sight of the werewolves, far removed from any expectation of finding Michael's ailing parents in a state of mundane illness, struck a chord of terror in him. He had envisioned a different scene, one where he would exploit the vulnerability of the situation to carry out his dark desires. Instead, he found himself facing a nightmare made flesh. As instinct took over, Brad stumbled backward, his retreat halted by the sight of Michael, who had silently picked up a heavy vase. Brad's mind raced, fragments of Michael's earlier explanation about his parents' illness crashing into the imminent threat. The vase shattered against him, porcelain shards and pain exploding across his face in a blinding flash. He felt the ground slip away as he crumpled, Michael's swift actions leaving no room for resistance. In a daze, Brad felt the cold splash of water against his lips, the sensation jarring yet oddly soothing as his consciousness wavered. Michael's words, delivered with a chilling calmness, were the last thing Brad heard before the darkness claimed him. "Don't be afraid, you will soon pass out and stop feeling pain." On the floor, Brad's eyes, wide with fear and confusion, sought Michael's, searching for an explanation, a reprieve, anything that would make sense of the sudden turn of events. But all he saw was the resolve in Michael's gaze, a determination born of necessity and survival. In those final moments before succumbing to unconsciousness, Brad realized the depth of his misjudgment. The basement, the werewolves, Michael's actions, all were part of a reality far beyond anything he had anticipated. His plans, his confidence in his ability to dominate this encounter, had been predicated on a misunderstanding of the true nature of the threat he faced. After securing Brad with sturdy ropes, ensuring there was no avenue for escape, Michael stepped away, his heart heavy with the weight of his actions. He sank into a worn chair, the creak of the wood a familiar sound in the silence that followed the storm of activity. As Brad lay bound and unconscious, Michael found himself enveloped in a moment of introspection, contemplating the path that had led him to this juncture. For years, Michael had been a shadowy vigilante, purging the city streets of those he deemed unworthy of freedom. Criminals, murderers, rapists, each had found their way into the basement that had become both a prison and a feeding ground for his transformed parents. The first had been a man in his 40s, a known rapist whose return to society had been marked by unrepentance and recidivism. Michael had lured him with cunning, delivering him to a fate that the law had been too lenient to impose. What followed was a series of similar acts, each target carefully chosen, their demise a twisted form of justice served at the hands of Michael's monstrous parents. Yet with each act of vigilantism, Michael's conscience bore the brunt of his choices. The line between right and wrong blurred, his actions a mirror to the darkness he sought to eradicate. Brad, his colleague from the morgue, represented a new depth to this darkness. Discovering Brad's secret, that he was a serial killer terrorizing their town, filled Michael with a cold resolve rather than satisfaction. Brad was a monster of a different kind, one that walked among them cloaked in the guise of normalcy, his sanity intact even as he sowed chaos. The revelation that humans could embody evil more profound than any werewolf or fairy tale monster unsettled Michael. It was a stark reminder of the world's complexities, where beings like his parents, driven by a curse beyond their control, seemed less monstrous in comparison to those who embraced darkness willingly. These thoughts weighed heavily on Michael as he gazed at Brad, the man's shallow breathing a testament to the life he still possessed. A life that had been dedicated to inflicting pain, to taking from the world rather than giving. Michael pondered the irony of his mission, the way in which his quest to cleanse the city had entangled him in a web of moral ambiguity. Was he a hero or just another monster? The distinction had become increasingly difficult to discern. As he pondered these questions, Michael understood that the true battle was not against the werewolves chained in his basement or the criminals that prowled the streets. The real struggle was within him, a fight to retain his humanity in the face of choices that threatened to erode it. The darkness he sought to eliminate in others was also a shadow that loomed over his own soul, a reminder that the potential for monstrosity exists in all of us. As the night deepened, Michael's thoughts drifted to his parents, their humanity overshadowed by the beast within. In their transformed state, they were innocent of the blood they spilled, their actions a survival instinct rather than a choice. This realization offered little comfort, but it provided a clarity that Brad's actions could never be justified by any means. Michael, his resolve hardened and his actions set, dragged Brad towards the bathroom, the final stage of his grim plan looming ahead. The house, silent except for the sound of their movement, seemed to hold its breath. As Michael prepared for the inevitable, a sudden, thunderous noise erupted from the basement, its intensity shaking the very foundations of the house. The urgency of the situation forced Michael to halt, his attention torn between the task at hand and the chaos unfolding below. Reluctantly, Michael left Brad, still dazed and bound, as he hurried to confront the new crisis. The basement, a place of dark secrets and desperate measures, now demanded his immediate attention. As Michael descended, the door swung open to reveal the chaos within. Meanwhile, Brad, seizing the moment of respite, fought against his bindings with a newfound desperation, fueled by fear and the instinct to survive. Back in the basement, the sight that greeted Michael was one of devastation. An iron post lay shattered on the ground, a testament to the force that had been unleashed. His mother, in her werewolf form, stood amidst the wreckage, her gaze fixed on Michael with an intensity that bordered on fury. The bonds that had held her were no more, and with her freedom came an unpredictable threat. In a panic, Michael fled the basement, his mind racing to devise a new plan. His path collided with Brad's, who had managed to free himself and, in a desperate bid for vengeance, was setting the house ablaze. The living room was already succumbing to the flames, the fire spreading with alarming speed. Michael, confronted with the immediate danger of the fire and Brad's malicious intent, realized the gravity of the situation. The fire threatened to consume everything, erasing any trace of the life he had fought so desperately to protect. Brad, knife in hand and hatred in his eyes, advanced, ready to end their confrontation once and for all. But fate intervened in the form of Michael's werewolf mother. Emerging from the shadows of the basement, she leaped over Michael with a ferocity that matched her primal state, targeting Brad. The confrontation was sudden and brutal, a clash of human and monster that left no room for mercy. This moment, fraught with danger and desperation, encapsulated the chaotic dance of fate, love, and survival that had come to define Michael's existence. His decision to protect his family, to rid the world of those he deemed unworthy, had led him here, to a confrontation that blurred the lines between hero and monster, victim and aggressor. As the fire raged and the battle unfolded, Michael was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. The choices he had made, each one a step down a path from which there was no return, had culminated in this moment of reckoning. The house, a symbol of his struggle and sacrifice, now stood on the brink of destruction, a casualty of the war he waged against the darkness. As the fire engulfed his home, Michael found himself caught in a maelstrom of smoke and flame. Each breath was a battle, the air thick with the acrid stench of burning wood and something far more sinister. Through the haze, he witnessed the culmination of his mother's transformation, a beast of myth, overpowering Brad with primal ferocity. It was a surreal tableau, one that underscored the inescapable truth of his situation. There was no place for him here, not anymore. Survival meant escape, and so he fled, leaving behind the world he had known. The drive away from the house was a blur, the flames that consumed his past a vivid glow in the rearview mirror. Distance did little to quell the turmoil within him. If anything, it amplified the realization of what he had lost. His parents, despite the monstrous fate that had befallen them, were still his family. Brad, though a harbinger of death, was a part of the life he had tried to maintain amidst the chaos. Now, all were reduced to ashes, their stories ended in a conflagration of his own making. In the sterile white of the psychologist's office, Michael recounted his tale, the words spilling out in a cathartic rush. Dr. Jensen, a seasoned professional, listened with a practiced calm, his demeanor reassuring yet tinged with a clinical detachment. "That's the way it was, son. I certainly believe you. You're doing great. You should get some rest," he offered, his voice a balm to Michael's frayed nerves. The sedative pill he provided was a promise of respite, a temporary escape from the relentless siege of memories and guilt. Yet, as Dr. Jensen made his notes, the stark reality of their sessions came into sharp relief. Despite his compassionate facade, the doctor harbored doubts, his pen tracing the words, "treatment failing," on Michael's hospital record. To him, Michael's story was a delusion, a tragic fantasy woven by a mind unable to confront the horror of his actions. The belief in werewolves, the fiery destruction of his home, these were symptoms of a psychosis that resisted intervention, a narrative too fantastical to be anything but the ravings of a broken psyche. Michael, left alone in the confines of his room, found no solace in the sedative's embrace. The white walls, meant to be a canvas of tranquility, felt like the boundaries of a prison, each one echoing back the enormity of his solitude. The world beyond, with its normalcy and light, seemed a distant dream, one irrevocably shattered by the night's events. The doctor's disbelief, though unspoken, hung heavy in the air, a silent judgment that rendered Michael's experiences invalid, his truth denied. It was a familiar refrain, the world's refusal to acknowledge the darkness that lurked in its midst, cloaked in the guise of myth and madness. But for Michael, the monsters were real, as tangible as the scars that marked his soul and the loss that weighed upon his heart. In those fleeting moments before the sedative lulled Michael into the depths of unconsciousness, a vivid memory surged with startling clarity, a ghostly echo of the night's horrors that refused to be silenced. He saw his mother's face again, not as the monstrous werewolf he had left behind in the flames, but as the woman who had raised him, her features twisted in fear and confusion. Her voice, laden with terror and disbelief, pierced the fog of his mind, a haunting refrain that asked, "What are you doing, Michael?" Story 4. The dark, starlit night hung low over the sleeping city. Only the lights in a few late windows and the dim glow of street lamps still pierced the darkness of the stone alleys. Grim shadows glided silently through the darkened corners of the streets, and a light breeze wandered aimlessly down the cobblestones, chasing scraps of old, torn newspapers. Tonight was a new moon, and the sky would not be graced with the moon's light, bathing the night in its enchanting glow. And so, the pale mist swirling above the grates of the sewers seemed more sinister tonight, dense and heavy with hidden intentions and secrets. Beneath the feet, trash, mud, and rotting waste crunched and squelched in every direction. From a rusted trash can came the patter of tiny feet and a hurried crunch, followed by the crumpling of paper, likely a rat rummaging through the scraps in search of edible morsels. Around, only the black brick walls of the buildings rose toward the heavens, as if sealing off these narrow corridors from the rest of the world. It seemed as though time itself was dying in these stone cages, never reaching the heights where life and freedom reigned. "Hey kid, got any food?" A dirty, disheveled head popped out from a pile of junk, and half-drunken, weary eyes stared at the late-night wanderer. The young man, who had wandered into these depths against his will, shivered as he wrapped himself tightly in his thin shirt. He only gave a puzzled look at this, something that emerged from the world, and hurried on, splashing through the puddles of decay and skirting piles of refuse. Behind him, a quiet voice called out, "Damn it, no food. And what's the point of wandering in the dark at night, bothering poor souls?" And silence returned. Another turn ahead, and then another, and yet another. It seemed there would be no end to this crooked street. At least the old half-blind lamps above the iron doors of the houses provided a little light. There was no other way but forward. The young man, who had been wandering the narrow streets so late at night, was named John. He had been born 16 years ago in the port of New York City during a crossing of the Atlantic. But it seemed at that time his family had no need for an extra mouth to feed, and so, just before the ship's departure for the Old World, his mother, overwhelmed by hunger and poverty, brought her newborn son to the nearest orphanage by the Church of the Holy Virgin Mary, where she left him on the dirty steps, disappearing forever into the night and fog. For many years spent in the orphanage, he had tried more than once to remember her face, but he never could. In the church, he studied for several years, learning about religion, history, and other sciences as teachers were available, until fate and the folly of a young mind compelled him to leave the home that had become so dear to him. He was cast out into the littered streets of the big city and plunged into the labyrinth of a new life. Hunger and pain led him to the dark and grim slums, where he sought his path, trying to change his life and escape the darkness into the light that was so fervently preached in the poor orphanage. But only disappointment lay in his way, sprinkled with grievances and hardships. Theft, fights, deceit. These filled his troubled life. Betrayal, death, and shattered dreams etched his soul with the sharp blade of anger and hatred for everything around him. And one day, cruel fate stepped on his throat, nearly choking him, and cast him into the deepest pits of hell. And there, the young wanderer had to find his path. He was tired and sat down by the black moss-covered wall, right on the ground. For too long he had searched for himself in this world, and had found nothing. And so the darkness filled his heart, driving out everything he had lived for, cherished, and loved. All around, only silent walls loomed, pressing down on him with their might, making it hard to breathe, tormenting his already exhausted mind. The cold wind burned his itching skin and sent a shiver through him as if electricity coursed through his body. So what should he do? Where should he go? Where could he find what he had long dreamed of, what he had strived for all these years? Where was the light of hope? Where were love, kindness, and understanding? Silence. There was nothing, and holiness was just a myth. Even the church, where he had lived for so many years, had vanished in the greedy flames of fire, and only the sparks, maddened in their wild dance, all that remained of love and hope, were carried up to the heavens. It was there, on the smoldering ruins, that his world died, the world he had known and loved since his birth, but which he had failed to save and so easily abandoned. And now, only emptiness surrounded him. "You're early tonight, my son," said Father Nicholas, opening the heavy doors of the orphanage and letting John inside. "I'm used to you either not visiting us for quite some time or showing up late at night. Has something changed?" He looked closely with kind eyes, radiating love and tenderness, at the crestfallen young man. "I'm tired, Father Nicholas," John replied with a heavy sigh. He walked into the hall and sat on the first pew from the entrance while the father closed the door behind him. "Something troubles me, and it feels as though there's a huge black hole in my chest, making it hard to breathe. And the darkness trails me, step by step. I'm tired of wandering in this fog. I can't see the way. And the place where I am now, the world where I ended up after leaving these walls, feels like a bleak, stinking swamp. There's no life, no light, no meaning." A dull echo lazily floated under the arches of the high hall, bouncing off the walls in the semi-darkness, illuminated only by the light of a dozen candles burning at the altar. Their flames burned steadily, barely flickering, filling everything around with a mysterious glow. "And you made the right decision to come here." Father Nicholas paused beside John, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Only here can you rest. sheltered from the turmoil that reigns outside, as if pausing the rush of time to contemplate everything that's happening. I will try to understand all your fears and guide you to the right path. But you must follow me. Only then can I lead you to the light. Yes, Father. I understand all of this and am ready to do what's required. But it feels like I don't have the strength for anything. My hands are heavy like lead. There's emptiness in my chest, a void. I'm afraid. What are you afraid of, my son? Tell me your fears without hiding them, and perhaps together we can find protection from them. But the beginning of the path is here. The father extended his hand, inviting the young man to approach the altar and kneel. I do not ask you to clear your mind. I see it is full of desires and passions. I don't need blind worship and vows of renunciation of evil. That's simply impossible in our world. I only wish to help you shed the unnecessary burden of worries and misunderstandings, to let your mind be free, and then you will be free to choose the path that appears before you. Thank you, Father Nicholas. I had nowhere else to go, and no one else to seek help from. Only here do I feel peace. This is your home. It always has been and always will be. Mother is very worried about you. She remembers clearly all the years of your schooling within these walls. You were a good boy. How is she? Is everything all right? I haven't seen her in a long time. She is well. A new group of students has recently come under her care since all those killings started in the city. Many children have been orphaned with no one to help them, and we are glad to have each one and are ready to provide shelter and food as much as we can. You should visit her sometime. You still remember her daily routine. She remains true to her principles and never wavers from them. Yes, I know. But then, a loud knock on the door interrupted him mid-sentence. Someone was furiously pounding on the copper-clad doors with a foot and shouting loudly, drawing the attention of those inside. It seems something has happened, the father said, hurrying to the doors, shuffling in his night slippers across the stone floor. Just a minute. Hold on. I'm coming. Once more, the intricate, heavy key turned in the lock. The iron bolt slid aside, and the door opened slightly. A blue fog, driven by the night wind, greedily burst from the street into the building. John saw Father Nicholas freeze, as if struck by lightning, but then he waved his hand and quickly began speaking with someone. He opened the door wider, allowing the night visitors into the church. It was a man and a woman. She was covered in blood, her side torn open, her arm badly scratched, and her eyes filled with nothing but pain and anguish. The man was helping her walk, her arm draped over his shoulder supporting his companion, but he wasn't in much better condition. His left leg was simply oozing thick blood, soaking his pant leg through. His haggard, bearded face was full of horror and exhaustion. But the strangest thing that John noticed in those moments was how Father Nicholas reacted. He still stood in the doorway but was shouting something loudly and monotonously into the darkness, as if reciting a prayer, waving his arms and making strange gestures. And then he crossed himself and forcefully slammed the door shut, quickly locking it with all the bolts and latches. He was breathing heavily, and his tense face was covered in a sheen of sweat. However, the father didn't stay in that state for long. He quickly remembered the late-night visitors and rushed over to them, who had collapsed from exhaustion just 10 steps inside the entrance. "How are you? What happened? Why?" he asked, examining the woman sprawled on the floor, while the man sat beside her, leaning against the armrest of the nearest pew. "It's madness," the man said, shaking his head. "It's hard to even grasp." "They were dogs," the woman whispered faintly, not opening her eyes, closed from exhaustion and loss of strength. She was breathing with difficulty, and bright red foam was bubbling on her lips, likely from a lung injury, which was a grave concern. "Dogs?" Father Nicholas repeated, uncertain. "Are you sure?" "Yes, those bloodthirsty beasts came at us right from around the corner. And their eyes, those red eyes, they tore at the soul. We barely managed to realize what was happening and got into our car, but that didn't stop them. They gnawed through the glass and metal as if it were paper, filled with madness. Oh, God. Red eyes." The woman was almost delirious, slipping into unconsciousness. "Yes, those eyes. They seemed to pierce inside me, turning everything inside out," the man continued. "I don't know how we managed to escape and make it here." "And what did you see outside, Father Nicholas?" John whispered softly, kneeling beside the woman. The father cast an angry glance at him. John had never seen such a look before and involuntarily recoiled. But then the father averted his gaze. "I don't know, but it seemed to me that ghosts were dancing in the fog and crimson light was illuminating them. I was scared." "We were too, Father, and we really need your help." The man seemed to come to his senses and looked into Nicholas's eyes. "Please help us." "All right. I hope my humble knowledge will suffice. Here." He pulled a small knife from the folds of his robe, suitable only for cutting vegetables at the refectory table. "Cut the pant leg, free the wound, and let's see how serious it is. Meanwhile, I'll examine your companion. Her name is Alice, and I'm Michael." Nicholas carefully unfolded the tattered edges of the woman's clothing, trying not to aggravate the wound in her side. The sight was horrifying. Part of the skin on her side was missing, and chunks of flesh hung in shreds among the bloody mess. "John, quickly run to the annex. We need clean water, bandages. Try to find a tourniquet and a bottle of tincture for treating wounds. It's on the shelf in the far corner. And hurry, as fast as you can. Her life depends on it." John jumped to his feet as if stung and rushed toward the doors to the storeroom where all the essentials for the orphanage were kept. Medicines, tools, powders, work clothes, fabrics and planks and beams for roof repairs. He tumbled down the wooden stairs and burst into the room like a hurricane, frightened by everything he had just seen. The pain that had tormented him for days receded in those moments, pushed to the background by the tragic events unfolding, but everything happening now only brought more fear. "All right, here's the tincture, bandages, rags, and a basin for water, got it. Wait, here are some towels and cotton wool, too. They'll come in handy. Can't hurt to have more." Grabbing everything he could in his arms, John dashed back up the stairs, even forgetting to latch the door behind him. Rushing to help, he had almost burst into the main hall where the services were held when a terrifying animal growl made him freeze in place. "Oh my God, this can't be happening." Father Nicholas's quiet whisper brought John back to reality, and he peeked out from behind a column into the hall. What he saw almost made him vomit, his eyes widening in horror, and he dropped everything he was holding on the floor before fleeing as if on fire. In the aisle between the pews, where just minutes ago he had left the father and the desperate visitors, much had changed. Instead of the wounded and exhausted man and woman, there now stood blood-soaked, ferocious beasts, gray wolves. Their muzzles were snarling. Sharp teeth gleamed menacingly in the candlelight, and their eyes blazed with a deep crimson. There was nothing human left in their depths, only death and a thirst for blood. Father Nicholas hadn't even had time to defend himself. He only raised his hands to shield his face and squeezed his eyes shut. And the two creatures of darkness and terror pounced on him with a ravenous hunger, mercilessly tearing at his living flesh. They ripped through his throat and tore open his stomach, sending a pile of slick intestines spilling onto the stones. Blood sprayed into the air, drenching everything around. That horrific scene was still etched in John's mind as he fled through the narrow, dark corridors of the orphanage, knocking over several candlesticks in his haste. And he didn't think about those who were still inside the building, unaware of what was happening, who needed help. John bolted out the back door into the street and locked it from the outside, bracing it with trash cans for good measure. Screaming wildly, he ran into the darkness of the alleys and disappeared into the depths of the impoverished quarters. Behind him, flames shot into the sky, several windows on the second floor shattered, and a distant wolf's howl pierced the night, spurring John to run even faster. Enough of sitting in one place. He had to keep moving. There had to be a way out of this labyrinth somewhere, and he had to find it. The young man got up and stumbled along the dark street. The number of streetlights illuminating the path grew fewer and fewer, and soon almost complete darkness reigned on the deserted streets. Only the fog, faintly lit by the starlight, thickened at the ground, spreading across the dirty paths. John was very tired, very hungry, and he couldn't get the final moments of Father Nicholas's life out of his head. The bloody scene refused to leave his consciousness, drawing all his attention, and the pain surged again, gripping his chest. Unable to bear it any longer, John screamed into the night, a long, wrenching cry. The loud echo answered him, shattering against the stone walls. But it didn't help. The pain still choked him, squeezing tears from his eyes. But then John froze. Did it seem so? Or did a painfully familiar silhouette flicker ahead in the fog? Father Nicholas, wait for me. It's me, John, Father Nicholas. But only silence responded to him. And without thinking whether it was real or just a trick of his exhausted mind, he rushed forward after the shadow. But there was no one there. Around the corner, only an old lantern hung lazily from the wall, casting its meager light on something John hadn't expected to see. Ahead was a solid wall. The street ended, and there was no passage further. Despairing, John approached it on trembling legs, kicking up old trash with his boots, and stopped, breathing heavily, just a step from the wall, touching its cold stones with his hand. He was doomed, it seemed, to wander forever in the twilight of these passages and streets, fleeing ever further from his nightmare, but the nightmare didn't retreat. It crept slowly behind him, sometimes drawing closer, sometimes disappearing again into the fog, and soon it caught up with him. A large animal shadow fell on the wall. It was the silhouette of an enormous, ferocious wolf, and the beast was slowly approaching the motionless man. Then something happened, but John, staring blankly ahead, didn't even understand what it was. His body was struck by a powerful blow, and bright red blood splattered onto the wall before him. He could only stare at it, still not fully grasping what it was. His thoughts and feelings seemed to die within him, and everything around was just a dream, a nightmare born of reality. Then came another blow, and John fell into the filth, collapsing onto the rotting scraps. Then came darkness, without sound, without smell, without pain, without nightmares. When John came to, it was pitch dark. It seemed completely impenetrable, yet he could somehow see everything around him. A part of the wall, a pile of decay and scraps, a heap of bundled newspapers. The pain no longer tormented him, and his thoughts raced in his head faster than swift horses. Where was he? What had happened? And then the answer appeared on its own. From the fog swirling in the dark street, a large black wolf emerged. Its thick fur gleamed silver, and its crimson eyes burned with a hellish fire. "You were accepted into the pack tonight," a voice suddenly spoke directly in John's mind. "Now you are one of us. one of Harlog's children. And in that moment, John understood everything that had happened to him that day, but there was nothing he could do to change it. And then John roared, spreading his arms wide as if bidding farewell to the world he had known, the world that had been familiar to him, the world he had understood. Afterward he collapsed onto the stones, his body racked with sobs. But soon his cries turned into a deep, guttural growl, and in the middle of the street a young gray wolf stood. Its red eyes gleamed like rubies in the darkness. "It happens to everyone. Accept it." John howled long and loud, raising his shaggy head toward the heavens, and then he bolted into the night. The second wolf vanished into the shadows behind him. Only the mist stirred above the ground, disturbed by the powerful bodies of the beasts as they disappeared into the darkness.